Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mer Herosner Podcast, Season 4, Episode 13. Thank you for joining us live on YouTube, Facebook, and X. And to all of you who will be listening to us on your favorite podcast platform later on, we appreciate you tuning in. It's Thursday, May 16th, 2024. I'm your host, Vic and Mike. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. Mike Balyan, sitting across from me, where we discuss our great Armenian history, covering different eras, topics, and people. Please hit that like button. Make sure you are subscribed and share with your friends and family. If you like what we're doing here, make sure you support us on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Mer and, donate starting from $5 all the way to the Kings and Queens, which is $20 a month to support us. And then Mike will come and hang out with you, do some chores, cook, whatever.
Says the bald guy.
Yeah. Well, appreciate you, volunteering to do that.
Well, it's your fault I'm not wearing a hat tonight.
Yeah, well, we have a special guest, and I said no hats. So
I feel a little lighter.
Yeah?
You're
looking good. You're looking good. All right, today's episode, we have a very special guest joining us in the studio. She is the director of the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. She is a distinguished scholar with a PhD in the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures from UCLA. Her groundbreaking research on Eastern Armenian heritage language speakers in Los Angeles has earned her numerous accolades, including the Society of Armenian Studies Distinguished Dissertation Award and the Russell Campbell Young Scholar Award. She's also the host of Language Therapy with Dr. K podcast, which I'm a big fan of. Everybody welcome Dr. Shushan Karapetian. How are you doing tonight?
Yay, wonderful.
Thank you for joining us in the studio live. I have been trying to get you on the show for a very long time. Went
this way, I went that way, I went that way.
And then you finally said yes, and we are excited to have you here. We've been, we want to cover language, especially Armenian language, and its history in the diaspora, its evolution. There's so many dialects, and we couldn't think of anybody better than you to help us with this topic, because we're students as well. We're trying to learn about this. That's the point of this podcast.
Should we be intimidated?
A little bit.
Yeah. So
I'm teasing, of course.
again, thank you. How are you doing tonight? Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Awesome.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me. I don't know which sanotner you tried, but
my cousin. You know who I'm talking about.
Yes,
yeah.
I do.
Before we get into it, we have a lot of topics to cover. I want to do some quick announcements, and then we'll jump into the conversation. I want to thank everybody who's joining us live. You guys in the chat, while we're having this conversation, you guys can ask questions to Dr. K, and we'll ask on your behalf. First thing I want to mention is the sculpture. As you see, this is our sample of the Hike Nahabet white version. This is the prototype, and they are in production. And here's a little bit of the bronze version. So unfortunately, not all the 20 batches sold. As we told you guys, this is going to Hike for Our Heroes. All the profits go to them for all the work they do. But we couldn't really wait, so we went ahead and gave the okay for production. It started already. We're hoping to get them soon and start shipping them out. But you can still order the white ones. We have about 6 of them left, and then roughly around 10 of the bronze left. So if you guys are interested to have this, you guys can order it. And like I said, the proceeds will go Hike for Our Heroes. They are also, if you are on YouTube, you should see a fundraiser. This is the next fundraiser they're working on, which is raising money for all the women who were displaced from Artsakh. Most of them are single moms, widowers. They are trying to get them back on their feet, become independent, possibly start their own businesses. So we're trying to help them. Whatever you guys donate through that YouTube link that's there, it's going to go directly to them. We have nothing to do with it. So it's connected directly to their account. So if you guys can support, we would really, really appreciate it. Let's see, what else? Warrior Saints. We announced Warrior Saints. That is live and going. That is the webisode that me and Mike were involved in. We helped produce. Mike's a leading role in there.
I played like 3 different characters, man.
Yeah.
You played a couple different
2.
characters.
Yeah, I was a warrior and also
Did we
a
post
Jewish
those photos?
priest. We did.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. So you guys go ahead and you can watch. I think they're on episode 4 now. It's 7 episodes. It's great production, and everything from Patreon that you donate will go to COAF Foundation, which is an amazing foundation. So if you haven't joined Warrior Saints on Patreon, please do so. What else? Vartavar. Okay. Hike for Our Heroes. So, this is their 3rd annual Vartavar event that's happening at Verdugo Park. I was there on the first one. Last year, unfortunately, I was in Armenia. Fortunately, because I got to experience Vartavar in Armenia. Which was amazing. This is the 3rd one, and it's free to the public. Yeah, this is July 7th, 12 to 6. It's such a good time. Last year, they had over 10,000 people during the whole time, going in and out. So there's going to be food, music, performances, water fights, obviously. And we are trying to work something out. There's a 80% chance we will have a live show from Vartavar. So
don't throw water at the equipment.
Yes. But so you guys can go to follow them on their Instagram, or they're all over Hike for Our Heroes. Just if you're going to be in the LA area, July 7th, it's a Sunday. Join us. It's going to be good times. So I think I'm done with announcements. That's it. All right. You guys ready? Okay.
Let's do it.
Damn, you got that done in under 15 minutes. Way to go, buddy.
Was it 15 minutes? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So, Shushan, why linguistics?
I was not supposed to be a linguist. I was supposed to be a doctor or a lawyer, as every other Armenian immigrant child. And my one big act of rebellion was not becoming a doctor or a lawyer. But then I didn't want to break my parents' heart, so I promised my dad that I would earn the doctor title. So I knew I had to go into academia.
Yeah.
I went in undecided. I took an anthropology class, and everything about it, a bicultural, bilingual perspective, made sense, that different people view the world through different lenses. I was supposed to do a PhD in anthropology and end up in some village in Armenia until I discovered UCLA had the best Armenian studies program in the world, and the department kind of groomed me. And then I ended up applying to do a PhD in Armenian studies, but to do 17th century drama written in Garapaj by Mkhitarist monks in Venice, until I coincidentally got a job teaching Armenian at GCC at age 23. Wow. Most of my students were older than I was. I was told I'm teaching a beginning Armenian class, basic conversation, and then I had a class full of Armenian speakers, some with PhDs from Armenia.
Okay.
And here I was going, Barev! Bug! And then I had a lot of what now I call heritage learners, but I didn't have words for them. These were young people who had grown up in Armenian-speaking families, but in the U.S., who knew Armenian, but didn't really know Armenian. Yeah. They could carry on a casual conversation, but couldn't write their name.
Yep.
And I was like, what am I going to do with these kids? I can't teach them like foreign language learners, and I can't teach them like native speakers. So as I was doing a PhD in 17th century Armenian drama, I was teaching these young people and these native speakers. And then I had a Japanese woman who was married to an Armenian. I had a Mexican woman who was married to an Armenian. I had a half Mexican, half Armenian kid, all who were searching for something from me. And I started kind of seeking professional development opportunities. And turned out there's a huge center at UCLA called the National Heritage Language Resource Center that specifically focuses on research and designing material and teaching methods and curricula for this particular group.
Wow.
And I signed up for a workshop. I had to Google heritage language. I didn't know what it was. And then we fell in love with one another, the center and myself. And it took me a year to tell my advisor, oopsie poopsie, I won't be doing the 17th century drama. I'd like to do something no one's ever done before, which is frame our language in this context. And that was that. And I haven't looked back since.
Wow. So how many years have you been at USC now?
So I've been at USC for 5, and then for 18 years before that, I was at UCLA.
UCLA. Wow. No, did you teach at UCLA or you just studied?
I did. So while I was in grad school, I taught at Glendale Community College in the beginning, and then I started teaching at UCLA. And then, just as a fun fact, I designed and taught a course on Hindi Urdu as a heritage language for Kane University in New Jersey. No, I do not know Hindi Urdu, but I am an expert on heritage language pedagogy. And so my advisor who knew my work said, could you design a class and teach it? And that was one of the most eye-opening experiences, because here we are as Armenians complaining, we have 2 modern standards and we're spread all over the world. And here are a group of people in South Asia who have hundreds of dialects.
Yeah.
And it made our situation look so much easier and better. And I learned such humility from them. It was the first ever master's program in Hindi Urdu pedagogy. Anyway, so yeah.
How many languages do you speak fluently?
Fluently Armenian and English,
Okay.
where in any context I feel comfortable. French would be my next strongest language. I have a minor in French. I studied abroad in France. I just haven't had a lot of recent exposure. Russian I studied in grad school. I can read and translate German, though I cannot speak and will not speak because I strictly took a reading class. And then, of course, classical Armenian I studied for my doctorate, Eastern, Western, and so on. I would love to study a non-Indo-European language. And when I'm done rearing multiple children,
Is there something specific that you would run to first?
Japanese.
Okay.
Wow.
Love. Arabic would love.
Okay.
Only because there's no familiarity for me to grasp on, right? So I know French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian. I know what I need to do to get there. I don't for these other languages. Sign language. I would love to explore sign language because it really shakes up the way you view language.
Now, is sign language different? Is it a universal or?
No. There's American Sign Language. There are.
That's a good question.
It's not a universal.
Okay.
There are universal aspects, but there are dialects.
There are dialects
of sign language.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. So, what's the term when you speak multiple?
Polyglot.
Polyglot. So, would you be considered a polyglot?
No.
No. Okay.
Polyglots are a very special case of people who get a kick out of learning new languages and develop a particular fluency. I'm a multilingual person. I'm comfortable in multiple languages, but polyglot really is once you pass like the 7 to 10 number and you're in beyond past a dozen languages and you're just picking them up. I actually recently interviewed a polyglot.
That's
on my
where
podcast.
I was going.
Yes.
The gentleman you had on who does Little Armenians,
Yes,
right?
Little Armenias.
Armenias,
Yes.
yeah. In on YouTube, you guys should go. They have an Instagram.
He's
follow
wonderful.
them. Amazing gentleman. By the way, I have to thank you for what you do with your podcast. And, I discovered your podcast by accident. I have this thing, I always, when I search for podcast, first thing I do is type in the word Armenian, see what comes up. There's a lot of stuff from people who have given up, 10 episodes, and then I came across yours. I was like, this is cool. Let me see. And I started listening. I'm like, this is really cool. Like, and every time you put it on, I enjoy it. On my drives, I drive a lot for what I do. So I'm listening to the latest one. I haven't finished it yet, which was with the gentleman from Argentina, right?
Artan Matiosian.
Yeah. And it's about the word genocide. It's so interesting. So interesting.
Yes.
You guys should go listen to it. I have maybe 10 minutes left, but it was...
By the way, Ruben's story, the one who does Little Armenias, when I met Ruben in 2019, he introduced himself as Ruben, not Ruben. Ruben. He was a half French, half Armenian kid who said, I'm French, I just have a funky Armenian last name. And then his uncle visited them in France, told the dad, he said, why don't I take him to Armenia so this kid knows where he comes from? He goes on an Armenian trip. Fast forward, I interviewed him this year. He now knows over 10 languages, does this whole Little Armenias thing. This one trip inspired this entire life journey.
Wow.
And now he's Ruben Kulaksizyan of Little Armenias. It was such an amazing experience for me as well to go through his journey.
That's amazing.
How long was he on the trip?
So he started in 2019, and then he went back for the next couple of summers and decided he's going to immerse himself. Now, what's super interesting is most French Armenians are descendants of genocide survivors. So his ancestors spoke Western Armenian.
Yeah.
He went to Armenia, immersed himself into Eastern Armenian, and then after several languages, Russian, Arabic, and so on, went to Lebanon and Syria to pick up Western Armenian.
Yeah.
But here is this Hayastansi sounding guy going to Lebanon, and they're like, Asiga Hayastan in it. Right?
Wow.
But it's an interesting path of going through Eastern to pick up Western, which is what his heritage language would be.
So interesting.
Strange because it usually doesn't work that way. Usually.
Yes.
I mean, it's rare, but it's always the other way around.
Well, right now,
was.
it's a very interesting time where, for example, UCLA offers both Western and Eastern Armenian. It's one of the few universities that offers both modern standards. You would walk into a Western Armenian class, half to 75% of the class are Hayastansi or Barskahai. You walk into an Eastern Armenian class, and there's a good percentage of Western Armenian speakers.
You're kidding.
No. And so in the first case, the Hayastansis and Barskais are taking Western Armenian because, one, they may have gone to Armenian school where they were taught in Western Armenian. Two, they may have a Western Armenian grandparent. They may have a Western Armenian boyfriend or girlfriend. Family. I call this Armenian for romantic purposes. This is what I did a lot at Glendale Community College. And then in the other case, Western Armenian speakers taking Eastern Armenian, they want to go volunteer in Armenia. Yeah. They want to go live in Armenia. They want to have some kind of connection. Also, Eastern Armenian is becoming very prevalent and dominant in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So it's such an interesting moment right now linguistically for how our two modern standards and all of the related dialects are in contact with one another. Like LA is the mecca of Armenian diaspora studies, language studies, and I feel so fortunate. Like I'm watching it happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
In 100 years, someone will look to us and say, "This is when it happened. This is
and it
how
morphed into this."
Yes,
and it's funny you mentioned that though. I mean, I know we might have touched on it every now and then with other guests or whatnot, but back then when I was growing up, there was a heck of a divide. There really was.
Oh,
because I mean, the school I went to,
there still is a little bit in the Armenian schools.
Yeah, but I mean, if she's seeing a progression or kind of a morphing
outside of school. In Armenian schools, and I'll tell you, my kids go to EGBU.
I don't know about that.
And it's very like Westerners go to Western Armenian classes.
Yeah.
Easterns choose the Eastern. I
also they have options.
Yeah, and yes, now they do.
So this is an interesting dynamic. Before there were no options, right?
It was always
Armenian
Western,
schools, and naturally, because
Yeah.
it was Western Armenians from the Middle East who came and founded these Ottoman era institutions.
Yes. Institutions. I like it.
Institutions. And then the Hayastansis and the Hayrenadartsner, right, the repatriates came, and the Barskahais, who were very much diasporan, so socio-culturally and socioeconomically very much in line with the Lebanese Syrian Armenians. Yeah. And that was that. And actually, no one said, "Oh, Esmer Hayrenachi of Island." That's just the way it was.
They did at home.
They did at home. Yes.
My parents did.
Yes, absolutely.
Are you kidding me?
At home. But no one said, how come they don't offer Eastern Armenian? We're in the diaspora. The language of the diaspora is Western Armenian. But there's been such an influx of Eastern Armenians, especially from Hayastan, that a lot of these schools have now hesitantly, begrudgingly, I think in some cases, added Eastern Armenian. Now, what is very interesting for me is now as a parent, you often have a choice. Right? Do you want your child to go into the Eastern or Western track? So one interesting thing is you have lots of hybrid families. Mom is Eastern, dad is Western. And if I had all the time in the world, one research project I would do is how are those decisions made? Who decides?
Yeah.
Right? Two, the Barskahais, who are Eastern Armenian speakers, choose often the Western Armenian track.
Yeah.
Wow.
I have
wonder
some.
why.
I think because they don't see themselves socioculturally with the Hayastansis.
Yeah.
They see themselves as traditional diasporans, and the Hayastansis are the only subgroup in the Los Angeles diasporic experiment who are going from majority to minority status. They come from a country where everyone looks like them, speaks like them. They don't feel persecuted. They don't feel minoritized. The whole duch, feathers, all of it.
Yeah.
It's a package. And Baskahs are not that, right? They don't see themselves as that. They see themselves as minority, one of the most important successful diasporic experiences in the history of the diaspora. These people have been in Iran for over 400 years.
Oh, yeah.
And they have had amazing status, amazing respect, amazing reputation. They come, they study, So I think what I'm trying to get to is language is always so much more than language. Just because Iranian Armenians speak Eastern Armenian doesn't mean they automatically enroll their kids in Eastern Armenian.
Yeah.
Because by language, you also indicate group belonging, right?
course,
I want to be seen like these people.
Yeah.
So anyway, the Armenian school scene now too is very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, listen, naturally my kids decided, we decided to go Eastern, but here's the thing. We're Antaptsi, we're Sidiatsi. So I grew up listening to Western. My grandma, my grandparent, all Western. But I was born in Armenia.
Right.
I was taught the Eastern. I can understand Western clearly. I can speak it too, but it just doesn't roll off the tongue, right? Because I'm used to the thing. And I've told my kids, I would want them to learn Western because you did an episode about Western Armenian. If that language dies, then the genocide is complete. And I completely agree with you. Because that is the last step in genocide, right? Yes. So I encourage everybody that, listen, if you speak Eastern, learn Western. If you speak Western, learn Eastern. And then, like you said, 100 years from now, there's going to be this beautiful dialect. And like you said, they're going to look back into and say, this is how it happened.
Who was it? Vic, who was it? Was it RP Krikorian we were talking to where she was talking about publishing more books in Western Armenian? Yeah.
Yes. She's starting to do that. A lot of stories. Her friend who was gonna be on our show, she's writing an entire
she was
like a
Michigan.
Fiction book.
Tamar Boyajian.
Yes.
Tamar, there you go.
We went to grad school together.
Yes,
She's writing a science fiction novel in Western.
Yeah.
But I think a couple of points should be made here. One is, most of us, or many of us from Armenia, I'm also born in Armenia, our ancestors are Western Armenian speakers.
Yes.
So I think what I'm trying to get at is that divide is very artificial.
Yes, I agree.
Of course
And
it
we
is.
do this,
Yeah.
right? We like, one. Two, knowing one, like you said, enriches the other. I tell my students all the time, it's all about your psychological openness and willingness.
Yes.
It's an algorithm you pick up. You say every time we say pa, they say ba. Every time we say ba, they say pa.
Yeah.
Right? And instead of eats, they say en. Instead of Yerevanum, they say Yerevanin mech.
Yeah.
A 5-year-old can pick that up. I tell my students it's a set of 24 rules. And then if you want to learn the spelling differences, office hours, 45 minutes. Like when you're reading The Economist and you see the word color spelled COLOUR. You don't rip up the journal and go, right? But somehow in the Armenian case, instead of saying, it's kind of cool, we have two spelling systems, or we throw chairs at each other.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I went through that. I went through that in Armenian school at Pilibos.
You went to Armenian?
Well, I went to Armenian institutions until 9th grade and finished 9th grade, and then went into the American public school system. But the way they taught me how to write my last name, Balyan, ba-te-pa. Do I write with a ba or do I write with a pa? And
Palyan.
so this is the way they would tell me to write it, when naturally I would write it with an A, B, C, A, B, G, right?
Yeah.
Balyan.
Yeah.
And so I'd have the teacher correct me because they were teaching Western Armenian. This
But
is just
hold
the
on
way
a
the
second.
school was taught.
But are the roots Palyan?
No.
With a P?
No.
It's
ba.
Balyan. Yeah. So
But I think...
But that was the interesting thing, because that letter could have been interchanged depending on what dialect.
Because in Eastern Armenian, you have ba, ba, pa.
Yeah.
In Western Armenian, you also have the letters, but instead of saying b-b-p, it's b-p-p. So in Eastern Armenian, we have a three-way system in a lot of our consonants, so g, g, k, d, d, t. And in Western Armenian, over centuries, the three-way sound distinction has been reduced to a two-way sound distinction. But the point I want to make here is it's not about what's right or what's wrong. In Western Armenian, that's
Yeah, it was
right.
correct. Yeah,
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So I tell my students every semester, I've been teaching for about 2 decades, if you get nothing out of my classes, and I hope that's not the case, I want you to leave knowing we have 2 perfect, beautiful, modern languages. One is not better than the other, one is not older than the other, one is not more sophisticated, and we are the richer for it. We are the richer for it.
Yeah.
So when you tell your kid, oof, you're not doing a good job for that, however many $100 you're
so
paying
true.
to send them to Armenia.
Very
So
true.
you should be saying, and so on and so on. And that post-genocide generation, who were mostly Turkish-speaking, by the way,
Yep.
mostly, overwhelmingly spoke either dialects of Armenian, dialects mixed with Turkish, or many of them were simply Turkish speakers,
Yeah.
regenerated an entire generation that was Armenian speaking. Parents were Turkish speaking. They sent their children to Armenian school and insisted that their children speak Armenian and teach them Armenian. So if they can do that,
We can do it.
we can
Absolutely.
do
Yeah.
we can do a lot.
I mean, we haven't even started the questions. It's been half an hour already.
I mean, it's still a great
I know
conversation.
we can talk for hours. I want to thank everybody who's joining us live on YouTube, Facebook, and X. If you guys have any questions to Dr. K, feel free to ask. Before one last thing before we start,
Sure.
we talked about this when first we kind of had a conversation. The diaspora, a lot of people think this word diaspora has been thrown around a lot lately, right? It became more popular,
Yes.
especially during this Artsakh situation.
Yeah.
Diaspora. But people think the diaspora kind of is after the genocide. But the diaspora is older than that. And I would can you kind of paint a picture for people to understand how old is the diaspora?
So, first of all, I have almost stopped saying diaspora. I say diasporas because there is no one homogenous entity called the Armenian diaspora.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Armenian diaspora communities. The Armenian diasporic experience is really as old as the Armenian experience.
Yeah.
But I think most historians would say in 387 when Armenia was partitioned, that's probably a definitive, so 4th century AD, at least we can safely say there have been Armenian communities living outside of the homeland. The Armenians in Iran, the Armenians in India, we've had merchant diasporas. We've had Armenians in Jerusalem for as long as
thousands of
there's
years.
been,
There's an Armenian school in India.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's, I think, one thing to keep in mind. And again, I really caution people to stray away. Even when we're talking about the LA diaspora, is there such a thing as the Los Angeles diaspora, or is there the Hayastansi Los Angeles experience, the Barskai experience?
Oh yeah.
Well, then
And
you
so-
can dissect Los
you
Angeles
can-
into different.
Exactly.
But you can dissect
The valley is
Exactly,
you
right?
can, yeah.
You can do it by the Hollywood versus Glendale in the 90s.
North Hollywood and
Barskai versus
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a very, very good point. I think the genocide gave birth to what we call the traditional post-genocide diaspora. Obviously, it was the biggest, one of the
course, yeah.
biggest kind of pushes for Armenians outside of their homeland. I think the other interesting thing to mention when we talk about diasporas, the word diaspora, if you looked it up 50 years ago, in any academic dictionary, it would say the Jews, the Armenians, and the Greeks. These are the traditional, archetypical diasporas.
Diasporans, yeah.
That's no longer the case. There are now queer diasporas, tech diasporas, IT diasporas, food diasporas.
So the word's been used
The
loosely.
word
with-
has been diluted
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
There's a sociologist, Rogers Brubaker, who wrote, now the word diaspora has a diaspora of its own. And like we might have just used it too much, right?
That's funny.
But there are some kind of defining core factors, which is there must be a real or fictitious homeland that a group is oriented towards. This particular group draws boundaries around itself, so they don't want to fully assimilate. And that there's some kind of engagement or concern with the real or fictitious homeland or with the culture and so on. So, but I think the point you bring up is very important, that our existence as a diasporic people and the role of language in that is by no means a new thing. By no means. I had a colleague who presented a talk the other day, and she put up a quote about community leaders complaining that the kids were speaking English. And 9 out of 10 people thought it was about our experience today in LA. It was like from 300-400 years ago by Armenian merchants in India who were so annoyed their kids are speaking English. Right?
Oh my God.
So
Wow.
super fascinating.
I want to take your class.
USC.
I don't know if I
If
can
you'd
go
like
back
to
at this
do
age anymore.
another degree.
Yeah. All right. So let's start with the topics. So the first topic, we're going to talk about the basics of language acquisition. So, for example, first language, second language, and heritage language, which is what you mentioned earlier, right? So can you explain like the concepts of like first language, second language, and heritage language? And to add to that, how is heritage language different from the first and second terms of acquisition and usage?
Yeah, so I think what most of us, all of us, know languages and have seen others pick up languages. I think the first primary and important distinction is between acquisition and learning. We learn our native language, our first language, not by learning, which is a very formal process. We acquire it, which in layman's terms is picking it up by ear.
Yeah.
So most of us can't remember how we learned our first language, but if we're parents or we're older brothers and sisters, we see it. So, for example, you never sit your kid down and say, "Bales nasti, gnal, yes gnumem, du gnumes, na gnumem, and gnumem." You don't do that, right? Your kid just babbles.
They
Just
associate it.
that means they're in trouble.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's like a
Sincerely sorry.
it's like a mental
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
association. They
Yes.
figure out by action what it means.
Yeah.
So the way we acquire language is, we won't go into theories. Some linguists say we have a language faculty in the brain. So Chomsky says we have a universal grammar programmed in our brain. Some people say it's a learned behavior. It doesn't matter. What's most important for us is you need exposure to pick up language, and we have a natural capacity for that. So we as adults or as parents don't teach our kids language. We model by the language we speak. And our kids simply pick it up and they figure out the algorithms.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's really important. Most foreign languages, second, third, whatever languages, often when we learn in an older age or in a school setting, that's learning a language. That you have a textbook, you have a teacher, you go through grammar, you follow rules, you learn the rules, and then you plug in the words. Okay. Now, heritage language is really interesting because we acquire it like a native language. So most of us, I think the three of us probably share a very similar linguistic autobiography, born in Armenia, raised here, or at least
Born here.
Born here.
Okay, but
Yeah.
raised in
But-
an Armenian-speaking
Yeah.
family.
Yes. Yeah. And
Okay.
exposed to both dialects heavily.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a heritage speaker has the same exposure that a native speaker does. So we picked it up by ear. I assume Armenian was probably your first language.
Yes. Yes.
But unlike a native speaker, we don't have that institutional formal support. So let's take a hypothetical child in Armenia. Let's call him David. David is born into an Armenian-speaking household. He hears all of his family speak Armenian. He's exposed to Armenian. He goes out to the park to play. All the kids in the park also speak Armenian. All of the street signs are in Armenian, well, Russian and now English. But then he goes to school and he's schooled in Armenian. Television is in Armenian or in Russian in some cases, in English, and so on and so on. The difference for a heritage speaker is they have that raw, natural exposure in the home, but because they don't live in the home country, everything outside of the home is typically in the dominant language, which in our case is in English. So they don't have all of the input from other sources, whether that's the street signs, right, outside, whether that's schooling. Even if you go to Armenian school, and we can talk about this later, the message you get immediately is English is the language of prestige. English is the language of fun. English is the language of Disney, of video games, of so on. So a heritage language is not allowed to develop to full capacity because you don't have input from all of the other sources that validate and legitimize and fine-tune what you picked it up. But the really important thing is, by age 5, a child has mastered most of the language. Age 5. A 5-year-old kid can crack jokes, which is a highly sophisticated thing to do. Can tell stories, can be funny, can be ironic, and so on and so on. All they're missing really is literacy, reading and writing. So for us in the diaspora, if you could, up until age 5, simulate, right? So I tell my friends who are about to have kids that those first 5 years are so important. The more exposure you give them to Armenian, the more you're setting them up for that foundation. Because what else happens at 5?
School.
Yeah.
The moment your kid leaves the house and goes to school, even if they go to Armenian school, that's it. They will transition within months. So most of us have that experience of raising Armenian-speaking children, and then they start school in months, like 4 months, 4 to 6 months. It's a done deal. And that's okay. I don't want us to lament that. All of our children will be English dominant.
Yeah.
It would be almost strange if we raised.
But that's the same for people who are Armenians who are in Russia. Or
Absolutely.
It's the same thing.
In any environment, as it should be. It would kind of be strange.
Yeah.
The question for us is not whether or not our children will be native speakers of Armenian. They can't be. They don't live in Armenia. The question is, as a heritage language, will Armenian be Khorovats kebab, or can it be more than that? Can it be more than a kitchen language? Verkat, shutara, khaytarakegank, amota, yevailen. Right?
Yeah.
It's true.
That's the question. And it can be so much more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of that has to do with the schools as well, right? I mean, to bring it, because if let's say somebody who their children, they can't afford to send them to Armenian school because Armenian schools are expensive, and they're going to public school, which is obviously English.
Yes. Though not all, and we can talk about that.
Well, yes, I know where you're going to go with that. But you know, what is their option? What do they do? Do they get a tutor from Armenia? What would you recommend?
So before I give my recommendation, schools are not spaces for language acquisition. Your child cannot acquire language the way I described it naturally at school unless it's an immersion school. So I say that not to scare anyone, but to say, as a family, understand that 0 to 5 period where your kid is yours. Do not think my Armenian is broken. Aveli lava spasem dprotsun. No, your Armenian is perfect because your Armenian is yours and you are your kid's favorite person in the world. Guess what? So any Armenian is better than no Armenian. Any Armenian is beautiful and perfect. It doesn't matter what dialect, doesn't matter broken, however you self-identify your Armenian, it doesn't matter. Expose your kid to it. School can polish it. School can teach your kid how to read and write. School can't be your lap. School can't be you tickling your kid in Armenian. School can't do that. School is a polishing, censoring apparatus. Now, are there immersion schools like the Lycée Français, right? It's a French immersion school. Lots of non-French people send their kids from age 2 to 12th grade, preschool to 12th grade, and you can produce a native-speaking French child. But everything is in French. It's a French, the country of France, whatever curriculum they use there, they do it here.
Yeah.
We don't have that model for Armenian yet. The closest thing is the dual immersion program we'll talk about. So what I'm saying is you can't outsource language acquisition. Not to an iPad, not to a school. It's you, your spouse, your grandparents, your family network, your social network. Because that initial period is it's really important. I'm not saying you can't do it after 5. Ruben did it in his late teens. Richard Hovhannisyan learned Armenian in his 20s.
Yeah.
But it's so much easier when you expose it earlier on.
I agree. I mean, the biggest challenge with most Armenian families now is Hayran Khosa, Hayran Khosa, Hayran Khosa.
I have something to say about that too.
We'll get to that.
But
I know
you
that's
wanted
one
to
of
say
the,
something, and I
Oh
interrupted
no,
you, I think.
I'm like Russian. Like for instance, like all my life, my parents have spoken Russian from back during the Soviet era. They were both from Yerevan, but I never picked up Russian. The interesting thing is, the words always sound familiar. I know what they mean, but I can't put it together in a sentence.
Also, when you hear Russian, don't you do this like I should understand?
Oh
Because
yeah,
you've been exposed to it.
1000%. I've been
Right.
saying it for the last
Yes.
10 years. I'm like, I need to learn this damn language just because.
But okay.
Just because, like, not because I'm gonna move there. Or
So
whatever.
you
just,
heard it, right? You heard language,
My whole life.
Russian. I spoke Russian.
I know, but
And I forgot
you were
it.
from there. You were in Armenia.
I mean,
they
I
were
can still
teaching
pick
you-
it up here and there, but I came here 9 years old. By the time I was in 5th grade, I completely forgot my
Like
Russian.
sometimes,
But that's
Because I was concentrating on learning English.
yes, and also the other really important piece of language acquisition that I haven't had a chance to mention yet is language is a means to an end. Language is not an end in itself. And I'm going to say this 20 times by the end of this conversation because this is one of my big messages I like to throw out there.
You want me to change the
it's all yours.
slogan?
It's all yours.
No, and I'll tell you why. So, why does a child pick up language? Okay, a newborn, an infant, a toddler, because they want their needs met. And do you have children?
No.
You have children. Okay, children are the smartest, most self-centered human beings in the world, and they're very
don't have to tell me.
pragmatic. They're very pragmatic and sometimes manipulatively so. Okay, so a child uses language to eat, to tell you that they're bored, to tell you that they're annoyed, to be entertained, to be loved, to be cared for. And language is a tool for them. And we as adults forget that, especially in all our patriotism and nationalism, right? So when you tell a child, Hayran Khosa, the message is Hayran Khosa, just what Hayran Khosas.
Yeah.
And a child doesn't understand the benefit of that until they come to my class at UCLA and USC. They're like, oopsie poopsie.
Yeah.
I should have listened to my dad. So we as parents have to be as smart and conniving as they are
Yeah.
and find reasons that are attractive to them. So, shachmat es uzum sobores. Here's the best shachmat teacher in the world. Oh, oops, he doesn't know English. So he's going to teach you in Armenian.
Yeah.
Interesting point.
Right? Or are you language has to be a tool to something they enjoy. So to impose Hayran Khosa on them doesn't make sense to them. And they ask really smart questions like, Khi?
Yeah. Yeah.
No, really.
My son goes, oof, and walks away. It's just like,
Inchi.
yeah.
So I did a number on my older daughter, who's been my little guinea pig. I sent her to an immersion Western Armenian summer camp at age 9, where she lived for 25 days in a campsite in the Swiss-French Alps.
Wow.
By herself?
With a group of people. Not teachers, they were called mediators, facilitators, a village. So they recreated a Western Armenian village. I didn't tell her it was in Western Armenian. I didn't tell her the goal was language. I just said, there's going to be yoga, there's going to be music, there's going to be cooking, there's going to be podcasting. Do you want to go to camp in France? She was like, sure. And the kids could call us once a week. So she called me the first week. She was like, Mom.
Where am I? Why am I here?
How many I'm like, okay, are you having a good time? She's like, yeah. I'm like, great. So she calls me week 2. She's like, I met these friends. She's like, իմ նման մի հատ հայաստանցի տղա կա New York-ից, mom. She's like, գիտես ինչ ձևի հայաստանցի? I'm like, she's like, ասում է խի։ Ինչի տղա ասում է խի։ I'm like, okay, cool. She threw in a Western Armenian word. She's trying to get a reaction. 0 reaction from me, intentionally. 3rd week, she calls me. Լրիվ արև մտա հայերեն խոս։
Wow.
Ինչ կնես գոր? Nothing. I say nothing.
That quick, huh?
That quick. And then she goes, Mom, չես նկատում որ արև մտա
Չես
հայերեն
հասկանում?
խոս։ I'm like, հասկանում եմ. She's like, բան չես ասում? I'm like, are you having fun? She's like, yeah, great time. Right? So, what did she learn in this experience? She learned music. She learned how to podcast. She learned yoga. She hung out with a chef from Canada who's this super famous chef who happens to be Armenian. The doctor on call at the camp was the first French doctor in Europe to do a double hand transplant, who happened to be Armenian and volunteered to spend the entire summer with these kids. So this camp found the best talent in the Armenian world who know Western Armenian. There was never any explicit language instruction. The first rule was never say հայերեն խոսիր. Never, ever. And even the way they grouped the kids into rooms, right? So Ani was in a room with a kid from Turkey and Greece. The only common language they had was Armenian.
What a fascinating experiment. And how long? She was there for 25 days?
25 days.
So, and okay, so now I have to ask, like, what in that 25 days, that exposure that your daughter got, I mean, how, I guess, fluent, lack for a better phrase or term, how fluent did she start speaking that dialect?
So it's a great question. Ani had a very strong foundation in Eastern Armenian.
Okay.
That's very important.
Yeah.
Maybe instead of answering your question, I can tell you what my goal was.
Sure.
And then my goal was for her. So a lot of my colleagues and friends are Western Armenian speakers. Every time they would come over, of course, we never transitioned to English, and I would never ask them to transition to Eastern. So I would just say, and someone would ask her something in Western Armenian, I could see her freeze. And I could see her worry that she might not understand or she might not be understood. So my main goal was to break that fear.
Yeah, there was like apprehension.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I achieved that. Complete loss of that fear.
Interesting.
And she made the
I can
patterns.
relate, and I'll probably talk about that later.
I actually want to ask you questions. But now she knows when we say, so I'll give you an example. Our closest friends for a long time were a Western Armenian couple who their first son was named Jivan. And they're at our house, and the kids are like 2 years apart. And Ani keeps saying, Jivan, aristech. Right? Jivan's not coming. Jivan, aristech. And then she's like, Mom, Jivan in kanchumam chi galis. And I'm like, why don't you pay attention to how her mom calls him? Mm-hmm. She's like, Mom, Tamar nasuma Jivan yegur hos. And then she goes like this, Jivan yegur hos. And then he came, she's like, Mom, score!
It worked. Crack the code.
So what she did at the camp was crack the code.
Yeah.
Okay? Or she learned that she can crack the code. That was my goal. In 25 days, you're not going to pick up an entire language.
Of course not.
Right?
Yeah.
But if you lose that fear that this is unintelligible for me, that's a huge win for me.
Yeah.
That, it's just a series of code. Just pay attention. Just pay attention. And you're like, this goes to this goes to that. Dun, 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 dun. So...
okay, so again, I'll ask later on, or we'll come back to, or circle back to it. But now this kind of leads into your identity of what dialect you want to talk or have conversations with people, right? And again, I'm asking this because I can relate to this because language and identity, right? How does that shape one's identity, depending on, let's say, your environments or what you're picking up and the people that you're talking to or the people that you're dealing with? Lord knows I've been through it. I'm not even kidding, because I have, and one prime example is I have a lot of Beirut High friends, and they have their own separate ways of social whatever, and it just naturally comes out. I can't speak my native Hayastansi with them. Even if there's one of them in the room, there might be a couple Hayastansis in the room, and I start speaking Hayastansi with them, and I'll speak Beirut High with him, literally all in the same room, in the same night. I'm making an Armenian salad with my words. And it's kind of wild.
Exactly the same
it's
thing. I
really
know what he's
weird.
talking about.
And so, but I know they have a different way of approaching life with their words and things like that, and as do we. So it's kind of like you're almost taking off your mask and then doing this and then putting back on that mask and then doing this to the rest of the people. So can you talk about that? Like, how does that make?
But that's not strange.
Oh,
It's actually what we all do. The difference is we live in America, which technically is a very multilingual country,
Yeah.
but ideologically is a very monolingual country because English dominates. And the point I'm trying to make is even if you only speak one language, so most Americans speak English, the way you speak with your friends is very different from the way you speak to your boss.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Those are masks as well. The way you speak to your best buddy, the way you speak to your spouse, like my spouse and I use the terminal as a code, right? The movie, like hoppa and this and that, right? That's a Shushan and Vaj code that only Shushan and Vaj have. Sometimes I do it at work and my team's like,
Yeah,
weird,
they don't get
right?
it. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the inside jokes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we live in a series of inside jokes.
It's
Okay.
a really weird way of putting
Right?
it, but it makes
Yeah.
complete sense.
Okay, so you two have a language that
Yeah.
the rest of us are not privy to, right? You have a
Absolutely.
code. Okay. It just becomes more highlighted when you're switching between Eastern and Western because those are recognized as two different standards, whereas Shushan and Vach English or Armglish
Yeah.
and Mike and Vic
Armglish.
isn't identified as a language. But really, all of those are codes. So I like to use the word codes. And we switch from code to code based on what identity we want to project. And a really interesting example of this is a recent project I've been working on language and masculinity, where I'm looking at Hayastansi men who came in the late 80s and early 90s and brought this thief-in-law, Orenkov culture. Am I hitting a nerve here?
No, not with me. Not with me. My family preceded that a long time ago.
Okay.
I'm good.
But they come here, and although they become English dominant, Armenian, and a particular kind of Armenian, right? Pogotsain
Yeah.
jargon
Yeah,
Armenian
the jargon, yeah.
is their way of projecting masculinity.
Yeah.
So, like, if you were to have a bazar or a razbirat, Okay.
Yeah.
English has no social value there. Hakaraka, if you speak English, your macho status
It drops.
drop. Like you may
Absolutely.
be excluded.
Bazari,
Exactly.
like bazar
Exa-
anelu.
Yeah, you're
So
right.
here's a domain where Armenian is not only the dominant language, it's the prestige language. Again, a means to an end. I told you
Yeah.
I was going to repeat it.
Yeah.
Right? Language
change
is
the title, right?
language is a means to showcase your macho status.
Yeah.
And that's why it succeeds in that domain. So going back to your like switching masks, some of the men I interviewed, and I interviewed everything from, men who had spent time in prison to lawyers and doctors and so on. All of these men are part of this subculture because it's part of our larger subculture. Some of them were Western Armenian who picked up not just standard Gerakan Parush Sebak Eastern Armenian, like Ara Aristag Eastern. They went to tutorials with their Hayastansi friends to feel more macho, to earn respect.
You got to puff that chest and you got to know how to talk.
So I'm bringing up this example to say language and identity are intimately connected, but our identities, if 100 years ago we thought our identities were inherited and prescribed, now the academy says they are negotiated. We negotiate all of our...
Interesting.
First of all, we have many identities. So I have an identity as a woman. I have an identity as an Armenian. I have an identity as a mother, as a scholar, as a friend. All of those identities are constantly in conversation with each other. And I'm negotiating, those identities in my social circles. Okay, so that's one. We have a plethora of identities that are constantly evolving. And we have associations, linguistic associations with each of those identities. So my identity as a daughter is an Armenian identity because with my parents, I speak Armenian.
Yeah.
Right? But my identity as a professor, even though I specialize in Armenian studies, academically, I think in English.
Yes.
That's one. And so on and so on and so on. So I think that's really interesting. And then the way you articulate and negotiate your identity is through language. So when you go to a bazaar, you're not talking to yourself, right? You are negotiating a conflict with someone else. And then the most important thing is there's 20, 30 guys assessing your performance.
Yeah.
It seems like it's an extreme case, but that's life.
I've experienced
All of
that.
life
Of course it is.
is
A performance.
performance
Yeah,
that
right.
is being assessed and feeds back into your now recalibrating who you are.
Yeah.
And that performance, sorry, just
No,
that
go ahead.
performance is through a language.
Yeah.
And often through multiple codes. It can be versions of one language, or it can be Armenian, English,
Yeah.
Փողոցի հայերեն, ռուսերեն, ախառը հայերեն.
Or the order of words in English and Armenian, right? When it shouldn't be that way.
Yes.
You're kind of flip-flopping certain words in a sentence, right? My mom makes fun of me about that all the time.
Or, as Vahe Berberian says, Arev Yelav Matav Hayeren.
There you go.
Right?
Perfect. You know, it's funny you say that now. Like my memory went straight back to high school. I went to Marshall. Well, he went to Marshall too. And I remember what at Jamon Anumain,
Well, I mean, I heard the cops every night because I live in Los Feliz.
But the thing is, I've been on the part where I had to perform, and I've been on the call it the supporting actors.
I am happy to say I've never been involved.
And I've been in a situation where I was the supporting actor and the main actor didn't perform.
Yes.
And he was almost ousted from the
Yes.
call it the clique.
I'll tell you, I started this project as like a quirky, interesting linguistic project because here I had found a domain where Armenian thrives. It's kind of become my metaphor for life.
Yeah.
And I had never realized
It's
when we talk about gender, we always think of women first and how hard life is for women. And it certainly is.
Yeah.
How hard it is to perform being a woman, how demanding it is. I had never realized how hard it is to perform masculinity and how restrictive it is. Because at any point, your masculinity is under threat
Yeah.
of being revoked. And it is
Which can ruin a man.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And I almost sometimes feel like the stakes are so much higher.
Yeah.
It's really, really changed the way I look at the world, the lenses through which, but also kind of, again, so I'm actually going to make this announcement, and I'm happy if you guys join. A new project I'm thinking about is vanity plates, like the plates on cars. I randomly, a couple of years ago, started just taking photos with some manto.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Planche. Laftara. De la veli.
I mean, we see him all the time.
Yeah,
especially
we
Glendale.
see them everywhere.
Send them my way because I'm
Yeah?
trying to write a research paper
Okay.
about this. How
I
Armenians.
think I have some in my
Oh my
Google
God,
Photos
please.
stored. I have to go sift through them.
Send them.
I've literally windshield.
Yes.
Photo.
It's a dangerous research project because I may have to hike up my car insurance. But it's another way that Armenians, through the Latin alphabet, are projecting
Yeah.
their Armenian identity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Through the limitations of a
7
vanity
letters.
plate.
Yeah.
Are like arms
That's
make,
interesting.
right? It's fascinating. Going back to language and identity. Oh my God!
There
What
you go.
type of
That's so
language
interesting.
identity
what-
association?
Okay, what made you not come up with that, but like what sparked that? Is there a particular
Before you
story?
continue, I'm going to add something to that.
Yeah.
Please.
We're going to make an announcement. So this is going to be a game now. All of you who listen to us and watch us will be watching later on. I have our Instagram QR code. And if you're going to listen to us, we'll post it. We'll have it in the body on the podcast platforms. If you see anything, it doesn't matter where you are.
Yes.
There you go.
Take a picture
Yes.
and you're going to send it to our Instagram.
Yeah.
I would be so grateful.
All right.
Yeah.
All of you who listen and watch us around the world, let's do this. Let's make it happen.
Yeah.
All
It'll
right.
be fun.
Continue. You were
Okay, so what was there a particular incident or something you saw that sparked the idea?
So,
Do tell.
Yes. So besides the fact that as a sociolinguist, everything for me is about language, to the point where we'll be sitting around a dinner table and my kid will make a statement and I'll be like, that was a very interesting mix of Armenian and English and the verb went here and da-da-da-da. And she's like, can we just be a normal family and just talk? So there's that. Or my husband will have to tear me away from like social engagements because I'm interrogating someone on their linguistic history. So I was doing a podcast episode for my podcast on Balot,
okay.
the game Balot.
Yeah.
How do you feel about Balot?
awesome.
Do you play?
I don't play it.
It's a fantastic game.
I know it. I just don't play it. I'm more of a poker player.
I love poker as well. Balot is another very interesting Armenian domain where in diaspora circles, American-born young Armenians will learn Balut through Armenian.
Yeah.
And then I saw a car with a license plate that said Quanch. And I was like, and in Balut, this is calling bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God. What kind of an association must you have with this game? Which, by the way, is a French game.
Yes,
Not even
I
an
know.
Armenian game.
There's apps called Balot.
Yes.
You can play all over the world.
That you invest the time and money to get vanity plates that say Quanch because you are projecting an identity
Yeah.
that says, look at what a tough, cool guy I am.
Yeah.
Right? That I have I mean, that's kind of amazing. And
That's
and
so
the
cool.
other really cool thing is you are betting and banking on the fact that there are enough Armenians out there who will get it.
They'll get it.
Because the non-Armenians aren't going to get it.
Yeah.
So you're doing this only for your
not
own
gonna
kind.
be able to read it.
Right?
Quench?
Yeah,
What's
exactly.
quench?
Exactly. So
Probably
that
your business
also
idea.
talks about the social capital of Armenian in this community. So we have enough social capital that my Latino house cleaning crew came to my house the first day when we bought our house. And his name is Lalo Gomez. And Lalo says, what kind of an Armenian are you? Are you a Vonses High or an Inchbeses High? And I said, I'm a Vonses High. And he said, okay, լուսամուտները երկու շաբաթը մեկ ենք լվանում, լվացք չենք անում, հատակները չենք անում. And I said, if I said I'm an Inchbeses High, he was like, I do the whole thing in Western Armenian. Lalo has picked up on the fact that Armenians are an economic force in this city. And the fact that he speaks, he's also picked up that we have two Armenians.
Yeah.
And he has learned both
Both.
because it tickles us that he does this. And he's making an amazing business choice.
Yeah.
Right? That's the social capital of Armenia. That's what got me is what kind of social capital does this immigrant heritage language have in this amazing city
That's
of
wild.
ours?
You know, you mentioned that. I just remembered. I need to get a hold of this. We got a book from. It was sent to us. There's a book that's written. I don't know if it's out yet or they just send us the promo version of it. It's a study on how the Armenians in Glendale and Los Angeles changed the
Yes.
economics.
It's by Daniel Fatante, who was a graduate of the same program I was in at UCLA.
This is a recent book.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't think it's been released yet.
It was released very recently.
Okay, yeah.
Does it have the word ethnoburb in the title?
I believe so. I have it at home. They people mail us books, so I have to reach out because I have to read it first. I haven't read it, but it's interesting that you mentioned that. Wow. Okay.
Ethnoburb?
Yeah.
I have the book at home. But yeah.
No, it's
That happened to be
a
it?
fascinating
Reminder.
Let me see.
No, that's not it. No.
The author should be Daniel Fatante, Fittante.
I will. I made a mental note.
Non-Armenian,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah,
who did a
non-Armenian.
PhD
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Armenian
yeah,
studies
yeah.
and picked up Armenian
Yeah.
later in life.
It's so interesting, but I mean that like you said the
Yeah.
So
No politics.
Yeah, I guess the just the kind of going back to your question. Let me see.
yes, that's the one.
the one.
Yep, that's the one.
Ethnopolitical, yeah.
Yeah.
Language and identity are intimately interlinked. But I think the point I want to make is both your identity and your linguistic profile are in constant flux. So
Yeah.
even your linguistic profile, right? So I ask my students every semester I teach, I say, if you're a bilingual, raise your hand. And I know 90% of them are. A third of them raise their hand. And I'm like, what about you? Well, I don't know how to read and write. I'm like, who said you have to know how to read and write to be a bilingual, right? Or they think that the current state is the permanent state. And then I'll tell them, again, Richard Hovhannisyan picked up Armenian in his 20s. Ruben picked up 12 languages after his 20s. Shushan at age 10 knew Armenian and Russian. Shushan at age 41 knows da-da-da. So everything is up for negotiation, up
Yeah.
for change.
Yeah, and another last point is sometimes when I speak Beirut Tahayren with some of my friends who, let's say, they don't know me that well, they're like, oh, but wait, don't you consider yourself Hayastansi, right? I'm like, yeah. And this is now they get
Yes.
confused.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, this has happened in the past, not in recent years,
Yeah.
but this has happened in the past tons of times. And they'll ask me that question. And I'm like, no, but I'm Hayastansi. Wait, where are your mom and dad from? And then these start to happen.
Yes.
This conversation starts to happen. It's like, well, my dad's side speak both. My mom's side doesn't. They speak just pure Hayastansi, but my mom's family's from Lennakan and da-da-da-da. So you start going down
in
the
Lennakan,
branch.
they speak a Western dialect.
Yes.
So,
yeah. So
right.
it's like, well, this is
It's funny. A lot of people don't get that.
Yes.
In Lennakan,
Yeah.
it's a Western dialect.
Yes.
In all the old movies, when you watch, it's
Yes.
Western dialect.
Because a lot of the actors are Western Armenians.
Yeah.
And this
But the stories are also told in Western Armenia. Some of the settings are, I
Yes.
think. So that's
Yes.
one of the reasons as well. Because, I mean, if you watch these old movies, they're all pre-genocide, right?
Yes.
So,
No, but
Katorma King and
again,
all this.
on my podcast, I have an episode with this young man named Vahagan Keshishan, who, if I remember correctly, was born in Armenia, and then his family moved to Syria, and then he spent time in Istanbul. Anyway, he has both. He can do both. He has made a decision that he's going to speak Western Armenian, and he lives in Armenia. Okay. And so he does these tours. It's called Western Armenian Yerevan. So he takes you to all of these sites. So the statue of Hiracha Ajaryan, who is a Western Armenian speaker, and all of these different places where there's a Western Armenian legacy. Because we tend to think Hayastan, Eastern Armenian.
Menak Hayastan.
Diaspora, Western Armenian. And neither one of those categories is actually accurate or true. Some of the founding elements of this fledgling republic, both in 1918 and in 1991, had a Western Armenian presence. So let's document that. Gyumretsis speak a Western Armenian dialect. It is my favorite dialect in the world.
Yeah.
In the world. Nothing. Most of my favorite writers, artists, musicians, 9 out of 10. It's a good bet. They're from Gyumri.
Yeah, even
Well, they were the
the
creative.
Well, I mean, even they could say some of the dullest things, and it sounds funny.
It's still
Yeah.
amazing.
When I was in Yerevan, we unfortunately we only got to stay in Gyumri for a couple of nights, and the hotel we were staying at, it was so after the earthquake, this place they built was actually by the Germans. It was a hospital where all the survivors were being taken care of there. And then eventually, obviously, years passed, the Germans left, and then they turned it into a hotel. So these rooms you're staying in are actually the hospital rooms that have been renovated. They had a little library. So we get there, it's like 10 o'clock at night, and I'm wide awake. We had a long drive. We did a whole loop from Lodi, and we're coming down, and the driver, who we became really good friends with, he's like, Go fe uzumes? I'm like, yeah. So, but nobody's there except this old man who's like the night shift bahak type of a thing.
Yeah.
We can't figure out what he's doing. He's like, like he opens it. Yes, sarkim the duk sarkik. We're like, no, make sarkik sing bomb. We go outside. He lights up a cigarette. We're sitting there, and he just starts telling stories in that dialect. Next thing I know, it's 2 a.m.
Yep.
And he's still going. And he's like, he's just like, it was, I remember everything he was talking about. And it was just stories about Gyumri, what happened, and during the earthquake and everything. But that language, it's
So
that dialect, I should say.
I had a similar experience in France. So I was 21 doing a study abroad program. This is before smartphones and GPS. And my big defect is I'm directionally challenged. Like I just have no sense of orientation. I thought at 20 I could fix it. At 30 I thought I could. At 40 I've given up, right? I've just developed really good social skills, and I make sure I have my phone charged. So anyway, I decide to go out by myself in Paris. Of course I get lost. It's pretty late. I'm starting to panic. And then all of a sudden, in very bright lights, I see Vartan Jasharan written in Armenian. And immediately I know everything's going to be okay. No matter what.
You have no idea. Go ahead.
Someone in Vartan Jasharan is going to take care of me.
Someone,
okay?
yeah. That's
so I
funny.
walk in, and a very French-looking waiter approaches me. And my French is solid. So in French, I say, I'd like to get a table. I'm ready to cry because I'm so terrified, and I'm so relieved. I sit down, and in French, I say, are the owners here? And this man comes far away. He's like, Aziz Can Daves? And I go like this. And And then, like you said, fast forward to 2 a.m. in the morning. This Gyumretsi man, his mother, his sister, his kids, and I are sitting cracking jokes. They have not let me pay for the food. They have packed food with me. They have ordered a cab for me. It was amazing. And all of it because I saw Vartan Jasharan.
That's
amazing.
awesome.
I had a similar experience, and I
That's
know
so
where that
awesome.
is because I stayed in Paris for a few months. My cousin lives there, and I used to I was 24 at the time, 20, and I would just walk around. I would just take the train or get on the subway, and I would just because I had nothing to do, and he was working, so I would just. But there was times where I would see Armenian institutions or whatever, or even hear Armenian, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, like I'm with my people, and it feels so you feel safe in a way.
Yes.
Because if something happens, you can go to them, and they will take you in.
I say this to my students too, and I think sometimes they don't imagine it. Imagine, okay, all of us, I call this the Armenian disease. I'm sure you share it. You walk into a room, you scan the room, and you tag all the Armenians.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yep. Possibly.
Yeah.
Paskahai. You know.
Yeah.
You do this. This is the Armenian disease. Now, after you tag them, you choose which people you'd like to approach. And then imagine 2 scenarios. Scenario A, hey, are you Armenian? Scenario B, highest.
Yeah.
Different scenarios, different identity, right? Different in-group. This is one in-group. This is a...
How many times have you sat in an Uber?
Yep.
Bro,
Best example. How
Not just
many times? Like your example's good, but I got a topper for
Tell
that.
me,
How many
tell me,
times?
yep.
How many times have you sat in an Uber? And I have a bad habit. I won't even look at the plate number that it gives you in the name or whatever. I just don't. It's just like whatever. My Uber is going to be here in like 2 or 3 minutes, right? I'll sit in a car. You can either tell from the 5 o'clock shadow or whatever. And there's been a few times I've gotten a Georgian driver from like Tbilisi, and I'm like, "Highest," and he looks at me. He's like, "What?" And like a heavy accent, and I'm like, "Where are you from?" And he's like, Tbilisi or something. I mean, they have a similar
Yes.
look, right?
Yeah.
Or someone from the Middle
Yes.
East, anywhere, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Syria, or where whatever the case is. You look the part. I'm going to ask you, or
Yeah.
I'm sure this has happened to everybody.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. It's that thing of scanning it. My kids do that. And I mean, we went to Disneyland, and my middle one, she was like, Ian. She's tagging it. She's tagging
Oh,
it.
a
Like
friend-
they notice that, or they hear it from somewhere, right? Real quickly, like yeah.
So a friend of mine, they had sent their children, I think, to Armenian school in elementary years, and then moved them to an American private school. And the kids had kind of an adjustment period. And my friend said, our daughter came home and she said, Mom, noren kerem gtel inka hayerena.
I didn't know.
What's the inka haya? Inka hayerena.
Yeah. Wow.
Right?
Look at how they identified with it.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Again, this is so much fun. We love it. We're learning from you, and I want to thank everybody who's joining us. Guys, don't be shy. Make comments, questions in the chat for Dr. K, and I think that's my mom who wrote an essay right there. Mom, I love you. Yeah, feel free to ask questions. All right, let's talk about the difficulties of transmitting Armenian in the diasporas, I should say, right? Well, obviously, we kind of covered the challenges with families. What are some of the primary challenges, families face when trying to transmit the Armenian language to the younger generation? Can you, what are your experiences that you see?
Yeah. I think, one, we make the mistake of assuming that our kids live in a native speaking environment and that the goal is to produce native speakers. And I think it's not, the reason we do that, for Hayastansis, it's obvious because they're coming from a nation state that speaks the language. And then for those coming from the Middle East, for a while, they did create an Armenian-speaking ghettos, not in a bad way.
Yeah.
Right? Burchamut is an Armenian ghetto.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Halep, right, had these Armenian speaking environments where not only at home did you speak Armenian, you spoke it at school, your baker was Armenian, your shoemaker. They created these like immersion camps.
Even Barskahais in
exactly.
Tehran, they did all that. Yeah.
So what works in Armenia, obviously, and what worked in these Middle Eastern communities 50, 60, 70 years ago does not work in the West. This is really important. And we impose these older models or these unsuitable models on our Armenian American kids. So I think, one, we have to, without lamentation, do away with the fact that we are going to produce native speakers. Our kids will be English dominant. Accept that. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
It also helps our cause that English is the most powerful language in the world.
Yes, of
so,
course.
and the rest of the world is trying to kill themselves to get their kids to learn English. For our kids, it's a piece of cake. That's one. Two, some families either don't see the value of Armenian or take it for granted. And again, I'll bring up Hayastansi families because the assumption is yes, Hayam. Yes, Hayachosem.
Yeah.
By genetic transmission,
Automatic.
by osmosis, by my blood, by the centuries of Armenian genes.
You have been ordained.
Exactly. You
Yes.
have been ordained an Armenian speaker. That is not how language
Yeah.
works. That's another one. So understand that transmitting language at its simplest requires exposure. Now, onto the exposure part. One is we don't think our Armenian is suitable to be transmitted. And we touched on this, right? Իմ հայրենը ուժեղ չի, լավ չի, կոտրտված է, կեղտոտ է, գրական չի. Do away with this. Whatever Armenian you know is perfect. It's your Armenian. Expose that to your kids. And then the other thing is assuming we speak Armenian to our kids, but we actually don't. So I have really good friends who are always complaining that their kids don't speak Armenian. And I'm always observing, of course. And one day, one of our friends said, Grikorjan, come sit on daddy's lap and tell me how your day was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Started somewhere.
2 words.
Went somewhere else.
2 words, one of them was the kid's name.
Yeah, I know. Well, Grigori.
In an Armenian pronunciation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Navachas Georgia.
Exactly. And then I started paying attention. So we assume we speak Armenian often. Or think about your language with your spouse or your day-to-day. Most of us function in Armglish.
Yeah.
A mix of Armenian
what are we eating
and
tonight?
English. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And for many of us, Armenian is just punctuation.
Yeah.
Gankas, English, 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 che,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah. Oh my
Okay.
God.
Yeah. So that's not enough to produce an Armenian speaking kid.
you're right.
No.
So we need high quantity and preferably quality, but I'll sacrifice quality. Just give me high quantity.
Yeah.
So in that regard, grandparents, I don't care what you think about their sleep training habits. I don't care what you think about how much sugar they give. They do it all in Armenian, and it's amazing for
Yeah.
me. And then for me personally, again, I know others have different priorities. I have 3 kids. I have had 3 nannies. My top criterion is must be Armenian speaking and not know English.
Yeah.
So that's what, obviously safety and so on. But
Yeah.
Boundaries.
Yeah.
Boundaries.
because your kid has no choice.
Yeah.
Right? Your
agree.
kid has no. So I think how we frame our kids and the product we want, the deliverable we want, has to be realistic. Our kids will be English dominant, and ideally they will know Armenian, and Armenian will be viewed. Armenian will be viewed as a source of enrichment and fun and joy, not burden, obligation. Our ancestors were being marched to their deaths and they were writing the Armenian letters in the sand. And you lazy, chaytarak, anamot, spoiled American boy can't even spell your name.
Yeah.
That's not going to get us there. Yeah. You can't shame your kids into speaking Armenian. It'll work for a limited period of time.
Yeah.
And then at one point, your kid's going to say, I don't need this.
I can speak from personal experience. Not that my family shamed me, but I think at some point, understanding that the level of Armenian that my family spoke, right? When I started, and I've talked to you about this off camera a ton of times, when I kind of phased away from the whole Armenian world. But when I started visiting Armenia a lot more frequently,
Yes.
oh my God, I was like,
Yes.
It's like I was like, okay, that's it. My Armenian needs to get better. Not through coaching or whatever, just through exposure, through whatever the case is.
Because Armenian was a means.
Yeah, but I mean, I went through.
I promise
Yeah,
you.
To an end.
It was a means to some kind of a discovery you were having, right?
yeah. I mean, you're looking at like the store tops,
Yes.
like the signage and whatnot, and you're kind of taking 3 or 4 seconds to read it. But wait a minute, dude. I went to Armenian school until 9th grade. I should right away. My vision should pick
Yes.
up on this, and I'm having to do this not because my sight's bad, just because I'm like,
See, your experience,
right.
was, like yours was a little bit different. See, I came from Armenia, so Armenia. I went up to
but
3rd grade,
visually,
reading,
you're-
writing, speaking properly. We all knew that stuff, right? We came here. For me, my challenge was I got to become American. I need to learn. I mean, I learned English watching cartoons.
Yeah.
You know, really fast, picking up the American accent, not to sound like I'm Armenian. You know, trying to change it, this and that, and that went throughout until junior high. See, I went to junior high in East LA. It was a magnet school for Armenians, 4 or 5 Armenians, right? And we stuck together, but we spoke English.
Right.
But when I came back to high school in Hollywood, all of a sudden it was almost like a culture shock for me. Where I was just like
Reintegration.
reintegration.
It was
So
the same thing with me when I
Then-
went to Marshall. Yeah.
my Armenian side came out, and it was more Armenian speaking, obviously English. But I think that's where I re-identified myself as an Armenian, was high school and then after high school. But before that, I was in this trying to run away almost from being Armenian because I wanted to fit with the American culture, become Amerikatsi, you know. So
You're literally describing the stages of what research shows as ethnic. It's called affiliation and distancing or disaffiliation.
yeah.
So when we're born, up until like elementary age, we don't understand what that means. We don't have an affiliation. We're like our mom's kid or our dad's kid or whatever. And then you start developing an affiliation. And then late elementary, early junior high is like a distancing,
Yeah.
a pushing away. And then high school, late high school, early college, it's like a kumbaya, come home, come back moment.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very. I had a very similar experience. to
So
yours.
interesting. So interesting. Again, I want to thank everybody joining us live on YouTube, Facebook, and X. If you guys want to enjoy more of this type of conversation, follow Dr. K's podcast, which is Language Therapy with Dr. K. The QR code is right there. Scan it and listen to all her episodes. Oh, how many episodes do you have right now?
I think we're nearing 30. I started very ambitiously, thinking I could do 2 episodes a month. And I did that for a while. And then pandemic hit, war hit, and so on. So it's been more like 1 a month. We did a live episode for our 25th episode anniversary, which was really exciting.
It's not easy. I can tell you from our experience, you know,
not.
when we started, we were weekly. And obviously
That was the plan.
that was the plan. But,
Yep.
you know, nowadays
But it's hard with historical content. It
hard
is.
because we do a lot of research. We have to fact check it. We have to put together what we're reading, what we're going to discuss. And typically we try to do at least an hour and a half information because we can't just read. And whatever topic we're covering, we're trying to find where it can be informative, where the audience is going to understand what we're talking about, or at least
Making
enjoy
it accessible.
Yeah.
Making it accessible.
But the thing is, life as we're getting older, my children get older, his, what he does with his work, my work,
works-
business, this, that, there's no time.
This is like our version of like
We've been
the
trying-
Thursday night poker game. Let's
Yeah.
say if we didn't do this, like let's say it was replaced with, hey bro, you want to drink some cognac and play some poker?
Yeah.
Well, instead we're doing this.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
this is what it is.
I mean, we've been
that
trying-
requires work.
We've been trying to record one
Poker
episode.
doesn't require research and-
research
yeah.
and work. Yeah, you just
yeah,
kind of have to have your lucky night that night.
So, but I understand that. So it's not easy. Plus, obviously, your schedule is, I'm sure, really, really
Yeah.
busy. You're doing so much, and again, and people need to appreciate what you do for our community. And
because it's an interesting topic that everyone always asks questions about.
Yeah.
Even Armenians, like Persian Armenian will ask a Beirutai, Beirutai will ask a Hayastansi, Hayastansi will ask a Persian Armenian.
Yeah.
It's a topic of Where did this come from? I don't know, man. That's a really good question. How many times have you got it? How many times have I got it?
But
It happens all the time.
you know what's interesting, talking about kind of community perceptions of what we do. When I was in grad school, and it took 9 years to do the master's and PhD, and I always thought it took long because I got married and had a family, but apparently I was the quickest to do it in my department. The average time to degree is like 12 years to do a master's and PhD in Near Eastern languages and cultures. And when I would tell community members, so Shushan ինչ անում հայագիտություն ասովորում։ Դե հայա էլի։
Yeah.
So the assumption is
Because we know everything about ourselves.
exactly,
Yeah.
which could not be farther from the truth.
Yeah.
First of all, that's not the case. Second of all, Armenian studies is a serious, rigorous. I'm sure you two know from your research.
yeah.
Endless,
And we're not even
bottomless.
scratching the surface.
Yes. And I took such insult to that. And I know if I had said Fransereni masna getem, I would have gotten so much more
Yeah.
respect.
Voy, 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 voy.
Merachika, right? But here I am learning the ancient version of our language, learning 2 modern versions, learning history, learning literature. And it was like, meh. Until one day someone told me, "Are you writing an autobiography?"
It's
When
so
I said
true.
I'm doing it. There is this
They
on
don't
the one
understand.
No,
hand,
it's-
on the one hand, there
Yeah.
is this like worshiping of our history and of our language. But on the other hand, there is this lack of depth of knowledge and this dismissal of any serious attempt. So when people say, "What do you do?" I say, "I lead a research institute focused on Armenian studies."
Mm-hmm.
They don't know what that means.
Yeah.
And then I'll say, I am studying us. Us. And what makes our institute so special is we do contemporary Armenian studies, which is the post-genocide Armenian experience. I am studying us, our lives. And also I'm thinking, what can the last 100 years tell us about the next 100 years?
Yeah.
Right? I'm investing in our future. And it's just like, meh, either meh or...
Oh, yeah.
Right? And sometimes I'm like,
Sa
what
kohki
is
sa lawyer.
that?
That's nice.
Do you know how many times people told me during grad school, including close family members, don't you just want to drop out and become a lawyer? I'm like,
God.
sorry, no insult to lawyers, but that's really boring for me.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but thank you for what you're doing. Truly, we mean that. And for us, doing this 3 years now, we came. We were. Oh, that light went out again. I think.
Again?
Yeah.
It's probably the
I'll fix
cable.
it. Yeah. Can you
Yeah.
see if you can? It might be the thing right there. Hit that on button. No. There you go. There we go. And then turn it on from there. It's on the back. Yeah,
there
there
we
you go.
go.
All right, we're back on. All right, sorry, technical difficulties, but it's you like I said, we started this without thinking what we're getting ourselves into, and the amount of stuff we've read and learned and conversations we've had with intellectuals, it really opened our eyes and
Well, it
to
was
understand who we are as people and how difficult it is to be Armenian.
But I think she touches on a really interesting point, because I think because of that, you and I know that because of our growing up here, you and I were both, well, at least I was, I don't want to speak for you fully, but you and I were both a little nervous about, okay, we're going to be talking about all this stuff, not about politics, but like, how are people going to accept this? How are
Yeah.
people going to,
yeah.
not necessarily in a bad way. It's like, whoa, what are these guys talking about, bro?
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean? That whole thing. Because you're
Yeah.
just used to this whole street ideology or whatever jargon. And I think, and even with the artwork, we were kind of well, what are people going to think?
Yeah.
You know?
I think sometimes I get frustrated when I hear people who I respect and I respect their work, say, others don't know us, others don't recognize us, others don't support us. And, in order to do that, we need to have narratives. We need to have stories and messages. And for that, we need to know ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think, kind of calcified, superficial narratives aren't enough.
No.
Yeah.
And it's there, folks. We had our first ever Armenian History Month celebration at USC this year. And I gave an opening speech where I talked about kind of themes in the grand Armenian story, and also the Armenian presence at USC. Everything from, it was an Armenian guy who invented the Japanese melon pan, which is like the Japanese sweetbread.
Really?
And do you know how I learned this? I had a Korean student take a class with me called the Armenian Heritage. Korean student from Korea who's studying anthropology at USC. My Bruin identity is kicking in. And he did his final project on this Armenian man who was born in the Ottoman Empire, crossed over to the Russian Empire, became the imperial baker to the Romanovs. Okay. And then the Bolshevik Revolution happened. And so along with the imperial family, he had to escape. He went to China, started baking. This Japanese entrepreneur tasted one of his pastries, found it so impressive, said, I'm opening a hotel in Japan. Will you come and be my lead baker? He moved to Japan, became the lead baker at the hotel, opened up his own pastry business, married a Japanese woman, made sure the archbishop from Istanbul, Constantinople, when during his visit blessed the marriage, baptized his 3 daughters, and then wrote to his Armenian American friends in a periodical in the U.S. saying, I hear the U.S. has the best education. I'd like to get my girls to America. And all 3 of his daughters were educated in America. One Armenian life. Japanese melon pan. Wow. Right? But ask your ask your average kid who graduated Armenian school. What are some grand narratives, right? What stories will you tell when someone asks you, oh, what is it being Armenian? What will they tell you? Right? The lack of nuance is what bothers me. Is there is so much there. It's not like there isn't anything there and we have to say, oh, April 24. There's so much, and we
it's
don't
funny
do
you
it
bring
justice.
that up. We announced season 5 is going to be all about telling stories of regular folks. So we put it out there.
Yeah.
People, because we have guests who come in and after the show, before they'll tell us stories about their grandparents or someone they knew that went through this amazing
and they're not
life
necessarily
and
like famous people.
Yeah, they're not famous, but and that's what we want to do next season. Yeah, because listen, we're gonna come point that we're gonna hit. The recent history. There's so much you can keep talking about it, but we want to tell stories of these people because there's so many interests. Like that was, imagine if that story is told on a first person basis or longer. Obviously, somebody
short clip TikTok video type things.
Oh my
man,
God,
imagine that. Come on.
So
anyway,
we actually thought of this
that.
as a research institute a couple of years ago, because typically in academia we tell the story of victors. More recently, we've told the story
of course.
It's usually men in leadership roles and so on and so on. So we thought, okay, the Armenian story is so grand, geographically, temporally, in every sense, and it's so nuanced. How do we capture the everyman's story and every woman's story? So, and we had thought of this pre-pandemic, but then the pandemic hit, and we launched this project called My Armenian Story, and it's a crowdsourced oral history project. So this is at the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, where you interview your buddy. We give you the questions in all the depth you need in 6 languages. You record it, you submit it, and we digitize it and archive it for posterity. Any researcher down the line can capture your story. So we've been doing this for years. And what's really important for me, because you said exactly what we were thinking, is it doesn't have to be a community leader or an important person. Any Armenian story is part of our shared history.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, and like I interviewed my in-laws, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law. I've been married for almost 20 years. I thought I knew them. I didn't know them because no one ever asked what was dating like in Soviet Armenia in the 70s. Yeah. Right? I didn't know my in-laws participated in the 1965 march to that eventually led to the creation of Tsitsernakabert, that their university president locked the doors of the university so they couldn't protest. And my father-in-law jumped off of the 2nd floor to go march to say this genocide happened and you need to do something about it. Like, I didn't know this. I certainly didn't know my mother-in-law's stories because she doesn't get to share them around the dinner table.
And that was that the memorial that was built, right? That was, correct me if I'm wrong, that's because of the diaspora who went back almost, right? Like the repats that went back because Stalin called them, because they're the ones who started voicing their stories because they're the survivors, right? I mean, my parents, my grandparents, all from Syria went back, right? Because the Soviet Armenians, they were suppressed. They weren't allowed to talk about it.
Absolutely.
So that movement started from the diasporans who went back.
It certainly played a role because in the 1940s, as you said,
46,
after
right?
44 to 46, after World War II, Stalin was like, we need to repopulate the Soviet Union because we lost so many. Absolutely. But what I'm saying is sometimes when we do these interviews, we get the following responses when I ask people, I want to interview you. Oh, I'm not important. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I'm not a community leader. I'm like, what do you mean you're not important? You're Armenian. Yeah. And then I asked them 3 questions, and they've seen 2 wars, 3 revolutions. They've changed 5 countries.
We've tried the same thing. Haven't we put it out numerous times? Like, dude, if you guys have a story to tell, message us.
So everyone says it's a great idea, and then they don't jump on it. And then we get the reverse, which is I tell my students, interview your grandparents, your parents, your neighbor, your whatever. And then they're like, but can I do it justice?
But like you said, if I sat down with you without this and without this, with a couple drinks, you would spill the beans for hours. My grandpa was on a boat in 1824 and come on, guys. Come on.
The number of people who've told me after the interview, thank you for making me do this because I make my students do it. But otherwise it's voluntary, folks. My grandmother died right after the interview. I'm so happy we have the record. A student found out her grandfather was a member of the Ottoman Parliament.
Wow.
Or great-grandfather, and she didn't know, right? The things they learn, or their parents or grandparents or family members will say, no one has ever asked me that question. And
can we borrow these questions?
Absolutely. It's accessible on our website. Okay. It's open to anyone.
That's so cool.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we need to talk after the show. We want to bring this to the forefront. This platform we have, the amount of listeners we have around the world, and the followers on YouTube, especially the podcast listen. We have a lot of listeners who don't watch us on YouTube; they just listen, and we want them. We want to tell these stories. Like I said, this idea came to me when I was in Armenia, because one thing I love to do when we were traveling through Armenia, I would just meet people and just sit there and listen to them. I would ask questions, and they would just talk and talk and talk and talk and. I was like, we need to tell their story.
They're excited.
No, but they're telling.
But they're excited to tell you too.
But like you said, probably nobody asks them those questions, because it wasn't just like it was more like questions. The questions I was asked was more about trying to pull something about their life, who they are, where they came from, how they ended up here. Why are you in Hakhbat? Why are you living here? How did you end up here? What was the point? Like all this, and then they go back and talk about generations of their great grandparents that were part of Tartads. Yes, I mean, and you're just like, oh my god, like
it's amazing.
Yeah. So,
and every story is historical drama.
Yeah,
of course.
Sometimes people think, oh, my story's so.
I am in love with Lori. Like I said,
but I think
world.
Capturing that drama is so satisfying and so exciting.
Yeah.
And even if the person doesn't think it's dramatic, you get the drama out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Okay. So moving on.
Yeah.
Moving on. There's some. I mean, this is also.
I think we're going to be here 4 hours.
I think this is going to spark another, at least for me, because I went through it. The educational system. I mean, specifically, I'm assuming the Armenian institutions, and if you want to break it down into, like, let's say the integration of American public school system, right? Because I went through both. What are some of the challenges with that side of things? Like, what are some of the obstacles?
So going back,
and you feel free to ask me questions because I went through both. I went through both.
I'll ask.
Yeah.
I think before we talk about Armenian schools, we have to talk about America, the beast that is America, and
Yeah.
American ideologies about language. It's a very recent phenomenon that being ethnic is cool. I think that's something we take for granted.
Yeah.
Pre-1970s ethnic revival, like 60s, 70s, it was not cool to be ethnic.
Yeah.
It certainly was not cool to look ethnic, to speak
Nope.
ethnic. So that Fresno generation, for example, there's a reason they're named Richard and John and Clark and so
Yeah.
on. And
Makes sense.
they anglicized their last names. They were called Fresno Indians, and that they were not allowed access to the YMCA or access to buy property. They were called dirty Jews and so on and so on. Armenians, right?
Yeah.
Just like the Italians were, the Polish were. First they were different, and then they became WASPy, and then new groups become the other. So all of this to say, speaking another language like Armenian could harm you, one, physically, two, socioeconomically. So I think sometimes we're insensitive about the old America highs who, parted ways with the language, but one must understand the American environment they were part of. I think we were fortunate to come of age in an America post-ethnic revival, and we had a community here.
Yeah.
That's really important.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to consider. Still, America has pretty negative attitudes about bilingualism, so I think we need to be aware of that it's always an uphill battle. And specific kinds of bilingualism. So, for example, if you're an Anglo kid picking up Spanish in an immersion program or in a Chinese immersion program, America says, bravo, so smart. Look at little Johnny. But if you're Jose trying to maintain your grandparents' Spanish from Mexico, America doesn't say bravo.
Yeah.
America says it's time you speak English.
Yep.
So I think we need to be aware of that.
Well, it's not just the U.S. There's
Of
plenty
course.
of different.
Oh, yeah.
countries.
I'm just talking
Oh,
about
yeah.
our
There-
situation here. And then when it comes to our,
But yeah, you're right. It is an
really
interesting dynamic,
interesting,
yeah.
The kind of the once you frame bilingualism differently, America has very different attitudes about what it means. And then you have these Armenians who came from the Middle East, starting in the 60s predominantly, and trickled in later. And all they had were these Middle Eastern models that were Ottoman era, that were themselves Ottoman models
Yeah.
of Armenian schools that worked pretty well in the Middle East, and they established them. And of course, it was the Western Armenians. And it worked for a generation because these were Armenian-speaking kids from Armenian-speaking families with Armenian-speaking teachers. But then that first generation came of age in America, became English dominant, and most importantly, American culture was viewed as superior to things Armenian. Whereas in the Middle East, Middle Eastern culture was viewed inferior. Armenians viewed themselves as superior to Arabs and Persians and others. And the language was part of that package. If Armenians did pick another language, it was French.
Yeah.
It was German. It wasn't Arabic. So what I'm trying to say is no one was prepared for the Western experience, what it means to be a minority, an immigrant in the West, in the most powerful country in the world, whose language now has become the global lingua franca. And I think, so the models that we have for Armenian day schools had a hard time catching up to this reality. One, to the American reality. Two, to the fact that one generation after, kids weren't coming as Armenian speaking. They were coming as bilingual, English Armenian speaking, and slowly they're becoming as English speaking. And they are trying to become equipped for that. They're a bit behind. So that's hard. And then, of course, the Western, Eastern, so many Eastern kids started coming that they had to also adapt to this. But most importantly, in order for a heritage language to succeed, you need quality and quantity of input. The way Armenian day schools function right now, most of the day is in English. They have a couple of hours of Armenian.
Yeah.
And most importantly, the Armenian language is always used for things Armenian.
Yep.
Okay? So you use Armenian to learn Armenian. You use Armenian for Armenian history. And Christianity, right? Religion.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's still like that?
Yeah.
Wow.
You do not use Armenian to measure a room. for example. You do not use Armenian to study about Martin Luther King
Or
Jr.
have a conversation about American history or economics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in the student minds, Armenian, the language, becomes only useful
You're associating.
for things Armenian which tend to look back,
Yeah.
which tend to be framed as backward and limited. And then English is this sophisticated language where you learn about Albert Einstein and you learn about social movements and social media and so on and so on. And I'm going to give a very exaggerated example, and I don't want this to be insulting. It is hypothetical. But Առաջի դասարանում, անգլերենի դասարանում you learn about Johnny and the Rabbit, հայերենի դասարանում you learn about Սուրենը ու նապաստակը.
Yeah.
Okay, երկրորդ դասարանում Johnny now goes to school, Սուրենը դեռ նապաստակի հետևից է վազում. Երրորդ դասարանում you learn about Einstein, you're still doing Սուրենն ու նապաստակը. And so in your English language world, things get cognitively
Progressive, yeah.
In Armenian, it stays at Suren and Napastak, and then they're like, here's Rafi.
I hate Rafi. No, I'm just kidding.
Gente, right?
Came out of it.
You don't have this gradual progression.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, they're like, Ches amachum Rafi ches kartatsel.
Yes, mi chem Rafi chem
Right? Here's
kartas.
Yarisha Charens. So it's this shock.
Yeah.
And the burden and the finger is always pointed at the student who
Yeah.
now feels incompetent, failing the nation, because of course the burden of the nation
Yes,
is on your
you
shoulders, on your
personally.
shoulders.
Because you didn't read.
Exactly.
Rafi,
But you have not been trained
yeah.
to gradually build up to Rafi, because Johnny went through, at least I went through, the Sweet 16 girls, and then I went through my teenage literature, and then I went to Jane Eyre and this and that.
Yeah.
It progressed gradually.
Yes.
We don't have that progression, one, because we don't have enough time in Armenian, two, because the things we do in Armenian are not creative, and Armenian is never positioned as a tool. It is simply an end to make sure we check off we taught them Armenian box.
So let me add
Interesting way to put
a question to this to this topic, I guess. What are like some non-traditional models or innovative programs that would kind of help to basically successfully promote the Armenian language within the school system? Like, can you give some examples?
So the most important thing, going back to my language acquisition model, is to have high quality and high quantity of input in Armenian, and particularly content in Armenian that is not Armenia or Armenian related. Okay. So for example, Glendale Unified School District has this program. It's called the Flag Dual Immersion Program, where the entire California state curriculum is taught in both languages. By the way, the program exists in 7 languages. So the next upcoming episode is with the person who leads this. So it's Japanese, Korean, French, Spanish, German, Italian, Armenian. Okay? So your child goes to kindergarten at GUSD. If you enroll them in the dual immersion program, half of their day is spent in Armenian, half of their day is spent in English. And whatever the state of California says a kindergartner should be doing in the morning of September 15th, your child is doing it in Armenian. And in October, they're doing it in English. So my kid, for example, learned about MLK for the first time in Armenian.
Wow.
Learned about missions in Armenian. Learned about the solar system in Armenian. She solves math word problems in Armenian. And this is so important for me because she doesn't view Armenian as only useful to talk about Armenians and mostly to talk about Armenian history. So the other day she was FaceTiming my dad in Armenia. They did fractions together in Armenian.
Wow.
Right? So, and then the regular response you get is like,
Yeah.
right? What's the use? This kid is an Armenian American kid. 4 plus 4 is always going to be 8.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter հայերենով սովորես թե անգլերենով, բայց որ հայերենով ես սովորում, you realize Armenian is a sophisticated language that can do calculus. You actually solve problems in Armenian.
Yeah.
So this is the simplest way I can say it. In order for our children to be functional in Armenian, they have to solve problems and be creative in Armenian. And when we unnaturally limit them to only doing things in Armenian, we do them a disservice, and we do the Armenian language a disservice. So an experiment I'll do in my college classes is I'll write a word like light, and I'll say, write me a reflection in Armenian. And you can't use the word Hay, Hayastan, Hayrenik, Hayrenasirutun, Ararat, April 24, 1915. Just do a philosophical, experiment. Right? Luis, just write to me about Luis in Armenian. And the kids who've gone to Armenian school will struggle in the beginning because they're used to doing that. Or the Armenian Educational Foundation has this rhetorical competition for kids who go to Armenian school. And so one year they asked me to be a judge, and they sent me the questions. So they have an English cohort and an Armenian cohort. So the English questions are like this, something like this. What is the impact of social media on youth's attitudes and day-to-day lives, or something like this? Or how do you see the future of global warming? And then, so those are the kids who are going to debate or give speeches in English. And then the Armenian says, So I wrote back and I said, I'll be happy to be a judge, but I suggest you reverse. So have them talk about social media in Armenian and have them talk about in English.
Yeah.
Right? We have a lot of students
That's super interesting.
Right? So that they
change the dynamic.
Exactly. Yeah. So Armenian should be a tool to discover the whole world, not just the Armenian world.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. So when you were talking about how you went back to Armenia, a lot of my American-born students will go to Armenia, and then I'll get an email or a text that says, did you know you could do calculus in Armenian?
No.
Or like, no. They'll go like, the whole judicial system works in Armenian. My relatives pay their taxes in Armenian. I'm like, yes. Yes. But you realize for these kids who've grown up here, they only perceive Armenian in limited capacity because that's all they've seen.
This is all you've been exposed to.
And that's not on them. That's on us. Yeah. This is important for me. That's why every summer I want the kids to go to Armenia, and I send them to local camps in Armenia, not to diaspora camps. Local camps. Go hang out with the local kids. Because the local kids don't compartmentalize. They don't think, the local kids speak about everything in Armenian.
Yeah.
Right.
Because they don't know. They don't speak anything else. That's their language.
Exactly. Because for them, the whole world exists in Armenian.
Yeah.
But for us, the whole world doesn't exist in Armenian. Things in the past exist in Armenian. Things very important and very significant, but untouchable and distant exist in Armenian. And then all the cool, interesting, forward-looking things exist in English. And I think in order for our educational institutions to successfully produce competent, creative kids in Armenian, we need to offer these kids. We underestimate how capable our kids are. So you mentioned that you've been exposed to both Eastern and Western. There's so many families right now where one spouse is Eastern, one spouse is Western. And often they'll reach out to me like while they're pregnant. I get these calls. It's like a side gig I do for fun. In full panic. I'm like, vocinch. Du ko arevela hayren khosi, du ko arev mata hayren. But won't the child be confused? And I was like, no. The child will be like, Mama ilezu, Papa ilezu. And they even know with grandparents. They're like, Tatik papik nene dede.
You know what's funny? My especially my oldest one and the middle one going to Armenian school. There's this thing within the kids which is very bizarre. I try to figure it out. They'll be like, Papa, when they speak Western, there's some words that we don't understand, but we're able to put the pieces together and understand what they're saying. She's like, but when we speak Hayastansi, they say we don't understand what you're saying, and they just walk like they don't even try. So they get frustrated. They're like, wait a minute, why is it that we can take the effort? Okay, maybe you use one word that's a little bit different, but I understood what you were saying. Okay, maybe not that word. But when we speak, and it's not like my kids use Russian words or anything, it's just a dialect, right? They refuse. They're like, no. Then they start speaking English to us. And I'm like, no, just go tell them, speak Armenian. Let's speak Armenian. If they don't understand, ask me, what is it that you didn't understand? Okay, what is it? I'll tell you what it meant. Start speaking Armenian. That's a big problem in Armenian schools and institutions. This division between Western,
Yes.
Eastern, and poor Pars guys are stuck in the middle because
They're
Yeah,
they're Eastern, just with
they're
classical
Eastern
or spelling.
Yeah, but you know,
Well, I think the most important thing is Armenian is not the language of play for these kids.
yeah,
Armenian is a classroom language, an imposed language, one that they venerate, by the way. So here, this is important. Kids all love Armenian. They worship Armenian. So one thing I argue in some of my work is we do a really good job with transmitting how important knowing Armenian is. We just do a bad job of actually teaching them Armenian. So all our kids grow up knowing that they should know Armenian and feeling bad that they don't know enough.
and it's our
Right?
fault.
It's our fault communally
Yeah.
for not letting these kids have a sense of ownership of the language. It's okay որ մի քիչ սխալ խոսեն. It's okay որ այով խոսեն. It's okay որ արև ելավ մտավ հայերեն խոսեն. It's okay. Կարևորը որ հայերենը տրորեն, ճմրթեն,
Այո.
mold it, shape it, rap in it. I don't care.
Yeah.
But claim it. Because when you, so I argue we put it on a pedestal and we kind of almost put it in a museum box
Yeah.
and say, worship it. But
Yeah.
when you go to a museum, you can't claim that. That's something from before. It's not yours.
And when they wrap it and they place it in that box, anxiety comes with it. And we'll talk about that. But
Yeah, I think just to finish there's a lot of innovative things happening. And by the way, when I talk about Armenian schools and I generalize, I'm making general hypothetical examples. Armenian schools are doing amazing work and they have produced amazing graduates who are some of my best students. But the general point I'm making is the innovative programs, first of all, give a lot of time to Armenian. They're not scared of immersion in Armenian. And by immersion, I mean non-Armenian subjects in Armenian. Core subjects.
It really
core
is true.
subjects.
and if I can add to that,
Yeah.
and I'll tell you from our experience with our kids going to Armenian school, when you were talking about how, you know, who was it in Napastak?
That was just a hypothetical
but
example.
whoever
Yeah.
it was in
Johnny.
Napastak, Johnny, you know,
Little Johnny.
Ruben
Little
and
Johnny and
Napastak.
Sudan and
Sudan and
Napastak,
Napastak.
yeah.
That has changed, and I'll tell you why.
Good.
Because now, at least, and I know that Ferayan is doing it, a lot of the
Yeah.
schools doing it, a lot of Armenian educators that have come from Armenia who were educated,
Yes. Yes.
they have implemented their study guide,
Yes.
and I'm seeing all my children. My oldest is in 6th grade, and I've seen her go from, you know, we went when she went to 4th, so this is our second, going to go to 3rd year. The way her Armenian has progressed, the way they're writing, reading, it's not the child.
Good.
And my youngest one already passed that phase, and they're forming paragraphs, they're writing stories, and
Amazing.
that is changing.
Good.
And
I know.
that's because,
I know. And that's,
yeah.
yes. And it's interesting that it's these teachers from Armenia for whom Armenian is a full language in full capacity, right?
Yeah.
And I'm very, very happy about that. And I only hope that, I think sometimes we have a complex that if our kids get exposed to too much Armenian, their English will suffer.
That's impossible.
Which, and I'm not going to dwell on this. The only thing I'm going to say is our kids breathe in English.
Yeah.
They will never,
Yeah,
ever. That's never going
there's
to be an issue.
there's too much exposure.
There's way too much
exposure through social media and whatever the
Already
case is.
like programmed in.
Even
Well-
kids who do these like French immersion schools where everything is in French are English dominant.
Yeah,
because
but
they
if,
live in America.
I mean, and I'll segue into
Yeah.
the next question because of this, which is interesting that we're talking about this, is no matter what you do, like you wake up in the morning, let's say you're of age, you're driving
Yep.
to your job, you turn on the radio or whatever,
Yep.
you put on a podcast. It's in
Yeah,
English,
it's in
dude,
English.
unless you've specifically planned on doing something in
Yes.
Armenian
Yes.
or listening to something Armenian. It's automatic. I don't think anyone should have anything to worry about. It's like, oh, it might
No,
impact
but you
their
would be
English?
surprised
Really?
with what a big issue this is. So when I was doing the orientation for
Immigrant families or born and raised?
Immigrant
families. Okay.
because the parents impose their complexes on their kids.
Okay.
So a lot of our generation, Vic, like you'll have parents who'll say, when I came, I didn't know any English. I had this very embarrassing or traumatic experience, and I never
Want to go
kid.
back to that. Yeah.
Your kid is not you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what? It's okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
It'll
It's okay.
it'll
It's
be okay. So I think there's a lot of really cool things happening both in Armenian schools and outside of Armenian schools. There's weekend programs. There's these summer camp, the Western Armenian immersion camp that's by the Gulbenkian Foundation. So many cool things are happening. There's so many resources out there. So even for families who may not, for example, there are families who are not Armenian speaking. They're Armenian, but they don't have proficiency in Armenian, but they want their kids to be exposed.
Yeah.
There are resources out there.
Yeah. And a lot of the times we do this to ourselves, and I am guilty of doing that, where, you know, it might be somebody who their Armenian isn't perfect. They might be using the words incorrectly, and I will correct them. And I've realized that that's the wrong thing to do, because then now you just kind of almost told them that don't even speak at this point because you're not using the right words.
Well,
and I've done that. I've done that, and I've realized that that was wrong, and because I just I embarrassed them at that moment, right?
But was
And
it
now
in
they're-
private, or I mean,
No,
again, I'm not trying to get
listen,
into a different topic.
Private, it wasn't a one-on-one. It was more like family setting,
Okay,
right? Somebody
that's
saying,
different.
they're like, that's not how you say it. That's not what, or like katakov, like kind of ծաղրում ես իրանց ասածը, and I've done that, and I realized that was wrong, because then now that person is probably going to be more that anxiety, right?
Yeah.
They're like, okay, I'm not going to speak anymore because I'm using the wrong words. But like you said, doesn't matter if it's broken.
Yeah.
Yep. Whatever you're doing, keep speaking.
Yes.
Keep speaking.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe one day someone will correct it in a way, or they'll be like, oh, maybe I should go learn the proper way or whatever it is. But like you said, keep speaking, because that's the only way the language is going to stay alive, right? Even if it's broken.
But at some point, like, you are still receptive to it, because it's still a part of one of the languages that you speak or want to speak. Like your kids, this is the way. I mean, look, personally speaking, if my mom ever like buzzed me on such like, I mean, maybe it wasn't in a public setting, or like it wasn't at a table with 10, 15, 20 people. But like, if let's say she did want to correct me because I used he or not barevdzez, du vonces instead of duk vonsek, something like this, I'm going to think about it. I'm going to definitely think about it and make that correction the next time that opportunity shows up.
Yeah, but if it's privately,
exactly.
your mom or
Not
anybody
like
else
sitting at a
that's what I'm
table
saying.
with 20 people.
That's what it is. I'm saying we shouldn't do that in a setting where, even if it's in a joking way or a loving way, we shouldn't, because it does affect
shaming.
that person. It's almost like shaming.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And I think the difference, so this is a really, really important topic for me, because it was one of the most unexpected findings of my research. Like, I never went into research heritage language anxiety.
Yeah.
And then everything I do around Armenian comes back to anxiety. The one thing that all diasporan Armenians share in common is we all think we're not Armenian enough. And most of it comes because our language we find to be deficient.
Yeah.
And how sad that the thing that unites us all is not being enough. Like, how sad that that's the common denominator.
Rhetoric.
Right?
A lot of rhetoric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so error correction isn't a bad thing in itself, but there are ways to do it, right? So like you brought up a really good example, which is like public versus private, because the public can be humiliating. But private can be very constructive, especially if you're open to it, right?
Especially with your kids.
Yeah, if you're in a stage. And also, the private can be not սխալ ես ասում, բայց տեղ կա որ դու պիտի ասես, տեղ կա որ դուք պիտի ասես. Խին տեղ ունի.
Of course.
Խին, if you're with a group of guys in a bazaar, you shouldn't be saying inchu, right?
Ինչու եք եկել այստեղ?
Inchu ենք այսօր միավորվել.
Արջուկի մոտ.
Or like, Parskahai say head.
Head, yeah.
Okay, do you know where head comes from?
No.
From classical Armenian.
You're
It is
kidding.
actually super proper classical Armenian. But your average
Wow.
Parskahai, yeah.
My father-in-law.
Դե հիմա գնա մարդկանց ասա.
Asafod, exactly. So when I say this, when I do professional development with teachers and I talk to them about error correction, I always get this, ինչ ես ասում, որ պիտի չուղենք երեխաներին. Okay, Կարող ենք ուղղել, անպայման պիտի ուղենք, բայց ասենք թե երեխան մի բան սխալ ասեց, փոխանակ բոլոր ընկերների մոտ ասես չես ամաչում, խի ես ասում, you just recast what they say in the proper way. So all kids make mistakes, including native speaking kids. And I don't know if you've had this with your kids, but most normal developing kids will say at some point, Jashika sutetsi.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which actually is a very sophisticated thing to do, right? Because most verbs take etsi.
Yeah.
Utel is a really weird one.
Yeah.
They're being fantastically smart.
They're combining
Yes.
things. Yeah.
Okay, so you don't in horror say, oh my God, sinch vichaka, ches amachum piti asas jashikes kera. You simply say, kera jashikat. And then after the 20th time, the kid figures out, this one's a funky verb.
Yeah.
And English-speaking kids do it too. They say, Mommy, I eated my sandwich.
Yeah.
The mom doesn't go,
How dare you?
all of the genocide surviving Americans will be rolling in their graves. The mom says, oh, you ate your sandwich, right?
Yeah.
So I tell teachers, I once was in an Armenian school classroom and the teacher was holding up, like she was doing something she thought was really funky and cool. She was holding up flashcards and kids were saying the word. And so she held up a bag and the Hayastansi kid said sumka and the Barskaya kid said kif. Right? And then no one said bayusak. And the teacher was like, schales, da-da-da, da-da-da. And then at the end, I was like, all you could have said is, inch bazma lezu dasaran unenk.
Yeah.
Թե ռուսերեն գիտենք, թե պարսկերեն գիտենք, because the moment you say սխալես, այդ երեխայի մաման սումկա է ասում. So you're saying քո մաման հայերեն չգիտի. Ու իր մաման գիտի պայուսակ բառը. Ուղղակի ընտրում է սումկա ասի, կամ տիկնիկ բառը, right? She held a doll and she was like կուկլա. Right? Իր մաման գիտի տիկնիկ բառը, բայց իր մաման կուկլա է ասում. So just շատ պուճուրիկ նուրբ տարբերությամբ the feedback.
And it's not a crime. It's like we make it
Of
seem
course
like
it's not. Language borrowing is natural and expected.
Yeah.
But I think if you damage the linguistic self-esteem of a person, so now they're terrified.
1000%.
They are terrified to speak Armenian because speaking Armenian always systematically ends in criticism.
Oh yeah.
You're not going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
So, it's
I've
as
been through
simple
it
as
too many
that.
times.
Yeah.
Been through it way too many times.
Yeah.
Okay, so through my travel experiences, I've met a lot of Armenians. Vic knows through our podcast. I personally met some people in France from different places. And their families are from the Middle East, like we were talking about earlier. Their Armenian is phenomenal. Like, I'm not even kidding you. I mean, they're Beirut Hayden, but their Armenian is phenomenal.
You mean
Like
Western.
almost, Western Armenian. I'm sorry, yeah, but flawless. Now, where I never really delved deep into where they got their education from or whatever, but family being from the Middle East, Lebanon, Beirut, whatever the case is. Why is it that there seems to be a little bit more of a, I guess, lack for a better term or phrase, like drowning of our languages the more west you go, as opposed to anyone from the Middle East?
Yeah, I'll give a really short answer. The Middle East, many of the Middle Eastern countries where Armenians formed post-genocide diaspora communities were remnants of the Ottoman Empire, which was, like all the other empires, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic. So these countries were shaped where this diversity in ethnicity, religion, and language was a normal thing and not to be eradicated. Slowly, this kind of nation state, one language, one nation model eventually caught up. So in Lebanon, in Iran, in Syria, it's no longer the case.
Yeah.
But 50, 60 years ago, it was the case. So it was okay in Lebanon that there were Armenian hubs where life functioned in Armenian. The government wasn't threatened by that, especially because Armenians were a Christian productive minority. In Iran, I mean, it was an Islamic country, and Armenians were given their status because they were not viewed as a threat. Whereas in the West, anything outside of this one nation, one language model is viewed as a threat. And also, something I hinted at before, the superiority, inferiority. Armenians position themselves as superior in the Middle East. They don't often in the West.
Okay.
So, and everyone wants to have access to what they view as desirable and superior. So I think, again, it's not okay for me to blame our kids and say, մենք Պարսկաստանում, մենք Լիբանանում, մենք Սիրիայում, հայախոս ենք, դուք ծույլ եք եւ այլն. No, we're in a different time, in a different context. And so I think I'll leave it there for now. But it is indeed a very good question to ask. And the environments and the times and the dynamics are completely different.
I mean, we've spoken to a few people from even those two guys, Setrak and Hakop, from the Save the Ark.
Israel,
from
Save the
Jerusalem.
Ark. Jerusalem, yeah.
God, the Armenian they were speaking was just like, it's flawless.
But I think part of why there is this element of Eastern Armenian speakers exoticizing Western Armenian as like this romantic, esoteric factor. So
I'm stirring my drink.
Yeah. Western Armenian speakers also code switch and borrow from Turkish, Arabic,
of course,
and all of the languages. There.
I mean, we do too.
Let's talk about code switching. Let's go move on because I want to. Okay. We don't have too much time left, and I don't want to keep you here till 12 o'clock at night. But let's talk about code switching because I know it's very interesting.
Armglish. Okay, we're all guilty of this,
and we shouldn't be guilty of it.
Well,
we should just be.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
Like you were mentioning earlier. I mean, we mishmash words. Let's talk about this.
So code switching in linguistics is defined as mixing two elements or mixing elements of one language in another or going from one language to another. So Gevorkjan, come sit on daddy's lap, or I had the most amazing the other day, right?
Chespat geratsni.
Right. So both of those are examples of code switching. The attitudes around code switching are that it's a sign of lack of knowledge of both languages. It's a sign of corrupting both languages. It's unacceptable. There's all kinds of negative attitudes. All of the linguistic science says it's highly sophisticated, highly regulated, highly standardized. It takes high competence in both languages to mix.
I feel a lot better about myself.
You hear that?
Yes.
I feel a lot better about myself. Guys, that's
Maybe
it.
I think we end the episode here.
That's it.
I can
all you naysayers.
Yeah.
And it's a very...
confirmation bias, baby.
It's a very natural thing to do. Anytime two languages come into contact or speakers of different languages come into contact, they borrow elements from each
also
other.
think it's beautiful.
It is beautiful.
Especially with Armenian and English mixed together. It is beautiful. Because listen, there are certain things in Armenian, it's a little bit weird to express, but Vorasmus Kyankas and then continue with English, it's
hello, my life.
Hello, my life. Hokies,
But I do want to make a little qualifying comment here. If we want to transmit Armenian and we want to transmit high quality Armenian, most language experts will say it is important to have monolingual exposure. So I am not saying give up on speaking only Armenian. No. There's no need to speak good, high quality Armenian. That's not what I'm saying. Yes, if you really want to improve your Armenian or your children's, it would be great to be in an environment where only Armenian is spoken, really high quality Armenian is spoken. That's all great.
Yeah.
But in reality, we all live in a form of Armglish, at least Armenian Americans.
Absolutely.
And you realize this, at least I realize this when I go to Armenia and there aren't English speakers. And I'm like I catch all the times I want to throw in an English word. Or when I'm teaching a non-Armenian studies class and my students are English speakers and my Armenian kicks in.
Yeah.
Right? And I have to suppress. It's kind of beautiful. I love my life in Armglish.
Yeah. It's actually, I'm not going to divulge what. We'll talk about it with a future episode. I'm working on a current project. Vic knows about it, and I'm dealing with some people that are from different places. Armenian, different places around the world, actually. so far from what I count, about 4 or 5 different countries on this project. And I find myself doing both, but they're also doing the same.
Mm-hmm.
One particular individual is from England. Well, he's Armenian, but like he's based out of England for now. And he's doing the same.
Of course.
So he's mixing Russian words with Armenian and then throwing in some English. So it's like Armenglish Russian, if you will. I don't even know if there's a phrase for this, but it's kind of this really interesting dynamic when we'll get on a call with like 8, 9, 10 of us. And now they're doing Armenian and Russian. And then there's English and Russian or English and Armenian. So that you have this like trifecta going on of like, it's kind of weird. And I've been paying attention to it over the last couple of weeks. It's really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I think from a linguistic science perspective, it's to be expected.
Yeah.
It would be really strange if Armenians lived in a different country and didn't pick up any new words or sounds or phrases or, you know.
I mean, just I think with any culture.
We're here, our case study is Armenian, but unless you're an Aboriginal tribe that hasn't had exposure to any other society, you have been in contact with others. Yeah. And
it's natural,
my guess is you saw something they do, a tool, a word, a something that you're like, hey, this is interesting.
Yeah.
And you probably use their word for it too.
I have to say, I've never seen our audience be so quietly just listening.
Yeah.
This is not a course, guys.
Should we be concerned? Sorry.
No. It's just like everybody's listening.
Yeah.
Like
they're quietly listening.
Listen, we're about 2.5 hours in. There was a couple other questions, but let's end it with let's talk about the pluricentric nature of Armenian. Let's talk about that, and then we're definitely going to have you back on because
I can leave in peace.
We'd love to have you back on.
Misconception about Armenian variants. Can we talk about that?
Okay, so unlike English, for example, actually, no, English is not a good comparison point here. Unlike a lot of languages, Armenian has 2 literary standards. That's what pluricentric means. It means we don't have one proper standardized version. We have 2. So we have modern Eastern Armenian, modern Western Armenian. We make these super simple classifications like Armenians in Armenia speak Eastern Armenian, diaspora speaks Western. We already covered that. That's not the case. But I think besides these 2 modern standards, we also have over 100 dialects.
Yeah.
And dialects really get very poor reputations as these like unsophisticated.
Outside of the main,
But really,
yes,
it's
true.
Yes. It's not that a standard language is inherently more sophisticated. Actually, from a linguistic perspective, standard versions are more simple because they've been standardized. They've been cleaned up of all the funky, cool elements so that they can be accessible to the larger group. Dialects are actually much more sophisticated, much more expressive, much deeper. And so I think a kind of final interesting component that I feel very fortunate to be a sociolinguist because I view every kind of Armenian as enriching to every speaker of any kind of Armenian. So the Gyumreti dialect, even though I'm not a carrier or a speaker of it, makes me proud to be Armenian. The Artsakh dialect, which is in the beginning seems almost incomprehensible, and then you listen a little bit and you're like, oh, this is what they do, and this is how they do it, and this is how they reverse it. Yes,
that's cool.
So I guess the thing is, all of us are speakers of some kind of dialect. Even if you speak modern standard or modern Western, if you say if you say steritz, if you say anderitz, you're a speaker of Khosakhtsakan Hayeren. And it's just as beautiful and useful as Girakan. So I think that the main point here is they don't have to be in competition. It's not this at the cost of that. It's this in addition to that. It's the masks you brought up in the beginning. We all need a ton of masks. And you choose your mask for whatever purpose.
Yeah, just you innately bring it with you. Like
exactly.
It's just what happens.
How many dialects are there?
So Raja Acharyan in the early 20th century counted about 120, 130.
Wow.
We've lost some of those. But if...
What about like current Armenia?
It seems like you both have traveled in Armenia,
Yeah.
right? And you know you can go 5 miles from
And it's a
one
different-
village
Oh, yeah.
to and it's an entirely
cross a
different
block.
dialect.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
amazing. So it's definitely in the
From
tens.
south
Yeah.
Yeah,
to north. Different dialects.
And it's amazing. And
Yeah.
you know what else? Every one of those people who speaks a dialect also speaks standard Eastern or standard Western, also probably speaks Russian and probably a European language or two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's normal. Most of the world functions in multiple languages and in multiple codes. And that's normal and amazing and beautiful.
It is.
Guido Vacancy, it's different. Kanakatsi,
Loretzi's
everything
amazing.
is
Amazing.
Yeah,
It's
there's
unbelievable.
been some of the dialects sometimes you hear on social media or whatever. It's like, what is he saying? What's going on here? It's like,
But spend a half a day with them.
yeah, and you'll
Yeah.
figure it out.
And you start
figure it out.
speaking like them.
Yeah.
Of course you do. That's called dialect accommodation. Even if we speak the same language, we start mimicking each other's tone, each other's pace, each other's
Yep.
intonation. We as human beings want to accommodate.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we make like a special sound thing or anything? No. Okay. So
just straight up.
time.
It's like, we gotta go
Time
to bed.
machine. Time, really?
No, I feel bad that we've kept you here for almost
right.
2.5 hours.
So-
So,
The time machine question.
Oh, wow.
If you had the opportunity to time travel, what time period and why?
Probably like the mid 30, 40 years between the 1830s and the 1860s. I would like to copy myself and be both in Tiflis and in Polis, because that's where a group of young Armenian intellectuals were fashioning two modern standards. So a group of young men were shipped out to Russian universities, to European universities, came back and were like, folks, we speak a language we don't write in. We have all of these new ideas. It's an amazing time of activity and productivity, and to be witness to like two modern standards being born simultaneously in two
Okay.
different empires. Is a really, really unique time. But I also have to tell you, and I said this earlier, I kind of love where I am now because we're witnessing something really, really interesting happening now, where I don't think at any point in our history so many variants have been in contact with each other in one like dish.
you know, when you say you can't wait to see what it's going to morph into,
I don't know if morph is the right word, but
Okay.
yes.
or
Yes.
what's the
What the interaction will
yeah.
look like.
yeah.
Yeah.
Evolution?
evolution
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the thing. Okay. So my grandma spoke Western, but she had an Armenian, the highest Auntie accent, which was the most beautiful thing. And one thing I miss about her the most was the way she would speak, right? And I think that's what it's going to become. It's going to be a mixture of both, and I think it's going to be beautiful language. It already is a beautiful language.
I think whatever it becomes, it's going to be its own unique Los Angeles Saharian, let's say. And
Or
it'll
anywhere
be-
else
it'll
in
be-
the diasporas,
It'll
right?
be
Yeah.
Harazat for us, and it'll express our lived reality, our experience. Yeah, it'll be. It's very interesting to watch and observe and be a part of it.
That's
Well-
by the way, that's a really interesting topic that your answer to the question about that
Period of time.
period of time.
Maybe we can have another.
That's
episode
what I
on
was
that.
gonna get to.
Yeah.
Seriously,
Will you come back? I'm
yeah,
gonna put
will
you on the
come
spot.
back if
Will you
there's
come back?
if you have enough information about that? That would be awesome.
I would-
really
we
awesome
would
to
love
hear
to talk
because
about
it's a very interesting period of
Yeah.
time in Armenian history.
Thank you for doing
Yeah.
this. Thank you for joining us. Is there anything you want to mention or promote?
yes,
Yes.
plug away.
Thank you. All right.
2.5 hours to this.
Two and a
No, I'm just
half
kidding.
hours.
Finally.
If you have stayed for
Yeah.
this whole
No,
thing
no,
and you're
no,
here.
Everybody's here. Everybody's here.
Okay, follow the Institute of Armenian Studies because we do amazing work. We document so many of our contemporary experiences. In November 2nd, we have an event coming up called Artsakh Uprooted, Aftermaths of Displacement. It will be a day-long symposium on understanding what happened, understanding where we go, but most importantly, it will start and end with the voices of Artsakhtsis. We will not speak on their behalf. We will be giving them a platform, whether it's a rapper from Artsakh, a social media journalist from Artsakh, the human rights ombudsman. They will be given a platform to tell their stories. So November 2nd, that's coming. Otherwise, we have events year-round at the Institute. You can follow us on all social media. You can check out our website at armenian.usc.edu. And thank you so much for having me.
Send us and also send
Yeah,
us
send
info.
us
We'll keep plugging.
Perfect.
You had
Yeah.
Loika on, right,
Please.
recently. I saw your
yeah.
post. I love his music. Oh, my God. I mean,
Yeah.
that guy is amazing. But yeah, anything coming up, share it with us.
us
We'll
know.
share it
We'll
on our
do.
episode.
keep
We'll,
sharing
we'll
it.
definitely
Thank you
do
so
it.
much.
If you guys want to follow, well, you should follow. Not
Yeah,
if you guys.
you
I'm
should.
telling you should follow her. There's her Instagram QR code, and go ahead and scan it. Also, follow her amazing podcast. Like I said, you will enjoy it. Yeah, listen to it, Language Therapy with Dr. K. And again, we're so thankful for you doing this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. This
This
was
is
fun.
this is so much fun. This is so much fun.
Hope
I
you
knew it
had
was
fun.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
did. This was great.
I want to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you guys for joining us live, being with us for 2.5 hours. We'll be back next week with a new episode. We'll continue with the Cilician. We're going to be covering the first kind of the princes and the lords. We're going to talk about all those kings.
Oh yeah, we're lining up something pretty good.
Yeah,
a little
yeah.
bit more
Yeah.
extensive.
So when you're asking where we've been doing research. Yeah, it takes time. It takes time. So be patient with us. Besides that, follow us on Instagram, follow us on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed if you're not. And do we have anything coming up as far as we need to
The
mention?
Vartavar thing, just people show up.
Yeah. So
That's July 7th.
July 7th thing
July
about
7th,
like I
yeah.
said, we're going to try to do a live show from there.
Yeah.
I'm working on it. We're going to figure it out. I think the main thing is having internet there so we can go live.
Well,
so we'll work on that.
A
But-
waterproof booth.
Yeah. So besides that, again, thank you everybody for joining us. As we always say at end of every episode, respect one another.
Love one another.
Until the next episode, take care of yourselves.